Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the most expensive neighborhood in the world, where women who couldn't vote, couldn't own property, and couldn't even speak in Parliament somehow controlled the entire British Empire. Picture this: 18-year-old girls in silk gowns, sipping tea in golden drawing rooms casually, deciding which men would become prime ministers, which laws would pass, and which wars Britain would fight. They never raised their voices. They never made speeches, but they held more power than most men would ever touch in their lifetimes. This is Mayfair. This is where queens ruled from the shadows. And tonight, you're about to discover how they did it. So, before we step through those gilded doors together, I have a small favor to ask. If you find yourself drawn into this story, if you feel that little spark of curiosity about these remarkable women, would you take just a moment to subscribe to the channel? Maybe hit that like button or share this with someone who loves history as much as you do. And I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I'd love to know you're here with me on this journey. Now, let's dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background sound that makes everything feel a bit more intimate. Let's walk together into the world of Mayfair, where nothing was quite as it seemed. Let me take you back to 1700. London is growing fast, spreading westward like spilled ink on parchment. And there, just beyond the fashionable chaos of Covent Garden and Soho, lies a stretch of muddy fields, completely unremarkable. These fields are part of something called the Tyburn Manor. And they're known mostly for one thing, an annual fair every May that's become so rowdy, so absolutely out of control that the aristocrats living nearby can't stand it anymore. Picture pickpockets, puppet shows, people getting drunk in broad daylight, animals everywhere. It's chaos, delightful chaos if you're a commoner looking for entertainment, but absolutely horrifying if you're trying to maintain any sense of dignity. The fair gives the area its name, Mayfair. And honestly, if you told anyone back then that this muddy, disreputable patch of land would become the most expensive real estate in the world within 50 years, they would have thought you'd lost your mind. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1721, a man named Sir Richard Grosvenor looks at those muddy fields and sees something nobody else does. He sees possibility. More specifically, he sees money. His family had gotten lucky, and I mean spectacularly lucky, back in 1677 when a 21-year-old baronet named Thomas Groner married 12-year-old Mary Davies. Yes, you heard that right, 12 years old. It was normal back then, horrifying as that sounds to us now. Mary Davies was an A's who owned massive chunks of land around London, including those muddy Mayfair fields. That marriage created the Grosvenor fortune, and by 1721 they're ready to turn swampland into gold. So they start building, and they don't just throw up a few houses and call it a day. No, they create something extraordinary. They designed Grosvenor Square, the largest residential square in London, with an oval garden in the center. Something completely new. Around it, they build Georgian townhouses that look like palaces, tall windows, perfectly symmetrical façades, elegant proportions. Each house is designed to impress, to announce that whoever lives here has arrived at the absolute pinnacle of society. And it works. By 1750, the aristocracy is abandoning their cramped old houses in Soho and Whitehall and rushing westward to Mayfair. Of the original 227 houses built in Mayfair, 117 had titled owners: dukes, duchesses, marquises, heirs. They're all competing for the best addresses, and the best address of all, Devonshire House on Piccadilly, a massive mansion that becomes the beating heart of British politics for the next 50 years. Now here's what most history books won't tell you. When we think about political power in the 18th century, we picture men in Parliament, men in government offices, men making grand speeches. And yes, that happened. But the real power, the actual decisions that shaped Britain, those happened in drawing rooms, in dining rooms, at dinner parties and balls and intimate gatherings where the social and political elite mixed freely. And who controlled those spaces? Women. Let me explain how this worked, because it's genuinely fascinating. In 18th century Britain, politics wasn't the formal, structured thing we know today. The Whig Party, one of the two major political parties, didn't have official headquarters. They didn't have campaign offices. Instead, they had houses, specific houses, where everyone knew to gather. And those houses were run by women. Think about it practically. If you're a politician trying to build support for your ideas, where do you go? You can't just schedule a meeting in some boring office. That's not how things worked. Instead, you get yourself invited to the right dinner party. You sit next to the right people. You have seemingly casual conversations over wine and roasted pheasant. And those conversations determine whether your political career succeeds or fails. But here's the key. You can't just show up. Someone has to invite you. Someone has to decide where you sit. Someone has to orchestrate the entire evening so that the right people talk to the right other peep, lay at exactly the right moment. And that someone was always a woman, the hostess. These women became what we'd call power brokers today. They didn't have official titles. They couldn't vote. But they decided who met whom, who gained influence, and who got frozen out. In a world where social connections meant everything, controlling the social space meant controlling everything. Devonshire House was the ultimate example of this. Its drawing rooms weren't just beautiful, though they were decorated with the finest art and furniture that money could buy. They were strategic. The Duchess of Devonshire, and we'll talk much more about her soon, didn't just throw parties. She orchestrated political theatre. She'd invite the Prince of Wales, the leader of the Whig Party, rising politicians, artists, writers, and carefully selected members of the opposition. She'd create an atmosphere where deals could be struck, where ambitious men could make their case, where the future direction of Britain got hashed out over tea and cards. And the brilliant thing, it all looked completely innocent, just a social gathering, just a pleasant evening, nothing official, nothing that could be criticized or controlled by the king or his ministers. But everyone involved knew exactly what was happening. Political decisions were being made, alliances were being formed, and the woman at the center of it all held extraordinary power, power that was completely invisible to anyone who didn't understand the game. This is the paradox at the heart of our story. These women lived in what historians call separate spheres. Men occupied the public sphere, government, business, the official world. Women occupied the private sphere, home, family, social life. Except that distinction was complete nonsense when it came to the aristocracy, because for them the private sphere was the public sphere. The drawing room was the parliament, the dinner table was the cabinet meeting, and Mayfair was the capital of this shadow government. By 1780, Mayfair had firmly established itself as the center of British high society. If you had money and wanted status, you moved to Mayfair. If you had status and wanted more power, you hosted gatherings in Mayfair. The neighborhood became synonymous with wealth, influence, and access to the people who really mattered. But here's what makes this particularly interesting. Not everyone could play this game. Yes, you needed money, enormous amounts of money. Running a Mayfair household wasn't cheap, but money alone wasn't enough. You also needed birth, breeding, connections, and something harder to define: the ability to navigate incredibly complex social rules without ever appearing to try. Women born into this world were trained from childhood for this role. They learned French, music, dancing, and conversation. But more importantly, they learned how to read people, how to make everyone feel important, how to remember everyone's names and relationships and grudges and ambitions. They learned how to host a gathering where everyone left feeling satisfied, but nothing obvious had been accomplished. And yet, everything had actually been accomplished. It was exhausting work, honestly. Imagine preparing for a dinner party where one wrong seating arrangement could end a political alliance, where serving the wrong wine could be interpreted as an insult, where every conversation had layers of meaning and you had to track all of them simultaneously while looking completely relaxed and charming, and these women did it night after night, season after season, year after year. The London season ran from roughly February through June. During those months, Mayfair came alive. Every evening brought balls, dinners, card parties, theatre outings, the streets filled with carriages, depositing elegantly dressed people at one glittering door after another. And inside those houses, the real work of running Britain happened. Men might have held the official positions, but women held the keys to those positions. Want to become a member of Parliament? You'd better know someone who could introduce you to the right people. Want support for your political ideas? You'd better cultivate friendships with the women who could persuade their husbands and brothers and fathers. Want to marry well and secure your family's future? You'd better get yourself invited to the right gatherings. Everything flowed through these social networks, and women controlled the flow. Now, I want to be clear about something. This wasn't some kind of feminist paradise. These women weren't fighting for equality or women's rights in any modern sense. Most of them would have been horrified by those ideas. They were working within the system as it existed, using the only tools available to them. And those tools were formidable, but it came at a cost. These women had power, yes, but it was always indirect, always hidden, always dependent on their relationships with men. They couldn't own property in their own names. Everything belonged to their fathers or husbands. They couldn't pursue careers or education. They couldn't vote or hold office. Their entire existence was channeled into this one narrow avenue, social influence. And the pressure was immense. You had to be perfect, beautiful but not vain, intelligent but not threatening, charming but not forward, influential but never obvious about it. One mistake, one scandal, one moment of poor judgment, and you could find yourself socially destroyed, cut off from the very networks that gave you power. The women of Mayfair walked a knife's edge every single day of their lives, but some of them did it brilliantly. Some of them turned limitation into strength, turned social rules into weapons, and changed the course of British history while appearing to do nothing more than pour tea and gossip. In Mayfair's golden age, roughly 1770 to 1820, a handful of women emerged who mastered this game so completely that they became legends. They're not in your history textbooks. They didn't sign laws or lead armies, but they shaped Britain more profoundly than most of the men whose names you do know, and their stories will keep you up at night. Because here's the thing about power that operates in shadows. It's often more effective than power that operates in daylight. When you're visible, you're vulnerable. You can be attacked, criticized, removed. But when you work behind the scenes, when you're invisible to everyone except those who matter, you become almost untouchable. You become essential. And these women, these silent queens of Mayfair, they understood that better than anyone. They built empires from drawing rooms. They toppled governments from dining tables. They made and unmade careers with a whispered word or a withdrawn invitation. And they did it all while wearing silk gowns and smiling sweetly and pretending to care about nothing more serious than the latest fashion from Paris. It was a performance, the greatest performance in British history, and it fooled everyone except the people who needed to know. So as we walk through this story together, I want you to remember something. When you see a grand house, ask who really controlled it. When you read about a political decision, ask where it was actually made. When you learn about a powerful man, ask which women made him powerful. Because in Mayfair, nothing was as simple as it appeared, and the most powerful people in the room were often the ones nobody was looking at. This is the world we're entering tonight, a world of golden cages and silk chains, a world where women couldn't speak in Parliament but could whisper in the right ear and change everything, a world where the most expensive real estate in London housed the most carefully guarded secrets in Britain. Welcome to Mayfair, where power wore silk and satin, and queens ruled without crowns. But that's just the setting, the stage, if you will. Now it's time to meet the players. And trust me, you've never encountered anyone quite like the woman we're about to discover. She was 17 years old when she married one of the richest men in England. She became an icon of fashion, a political force, and a scandal all at once. Her name was Georgiana, and she was about to turn Mayfair and all of Britain upside down. But that's a story for the next part of our journey. And believe me, you're not going to want to miss it. Imagine being 17 years old and waking up one morning as one of the most famous women in England. Not because you'd done anything particularly extraordinary, but simply because you'd married the right man. That's exactly what happened to Georgiana Spencer on her wedding day, June 7th, 1774. She went to bed as Lady Georgiana, daughter of an earl well-connected but relatively unknown. She woke up married to William Candish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire, the second richest man in all of Britain, and suddenly everyone wanted to know everything about her. But here's what makes Georgiana's story so captivating. She didn't just accept fame, she weaponized it. She took the spotlight that marriage gave her and turned it into something nobody had seen before. A woman who didn't just influence politics from behind closed doors, but who walked right out into the streets and fought for what she believed in, and it nearly destroyed her. Let's start at the beginning, though, because Georgiana's childhood shaped everything that came after. E was born at Althorpe, that's the Spencer family, a estate in Northamptonshire, into a world of privilege but also genuine warmth. Her parents, unlike many aristocratic couples of the time, actually loved each other. Can you imagine? Her father, John Spencer, was shy in public but tender at home. Her mother, Georgiana Poyntz, was intelligent and cultured. They traveled extensively with their children, exposing young Georgiana to art, literature, and ideas that most girls of her class never encountered. And Georgiana was brilliant, not just socially graceful, though she was that too, but genuinely intellectually curious. She read voraciously. She studied French, Italian, and music. She had this natural gift for making people feel seen and heard. Even as a child, people noticed her. She had this way of lighting up a room without trying, of making conversation feel effortless and exciting. So when she turned 15 and her family took her to Spa, a fashionable resort town in what's now Belgium, and she happened to meet William Candish, the 26-year-old Duke of Devonshire, everyone thought perfect match. He was wealthy, titled, and from a family as distinguished as her own. She was beautiful, charming, and from impeccable stock. It looked like a fairy tale. Except William Candish was nothing like Georgiana's warm, affectionate father. He was cold, distant, emotionally unavailable in a way that would be diagnosed and treated today, but was just considered normal aristocratic reserve back then. He had already had a mistress and an illegitimate child tucked away in the countryside. He wasn't looking for love or companionship. He was looking for a wife who could give him a legitimate heir and manage his social obligations. Georgiana, 17 years old and in love with the idea of love, didn't see any of this coming. They married in June 1774, and Georgiana stepped into a role she wasn't remotely prepared for. Suddenly, she was Duchess of Devonshire, mistress of multiple grand houses, including that magnificent Devonshire house in Mayfair. She was expected to host gatherings for hundreds of people, to navigate complex social hierarchies, to represent one of England's most important families. And she was supposed to do it all perfectly immediately, without making a single mistake. Oh, and produce a male heir. That was the most important job of all. The pressure was crushing. But here's where we see the first glimpse of Georgiana's extraordinary character. Instead of crumbling under that pressure, she transformed it into opportunity. She couldn't change her husband. He remained distant and increasingly involved with other women. She couldn't escape her role, but she could redefine what that role meant. Within months, Georgiana had become the most talked about woman in London. Every outfit she wore started a trend. She pioneered this elaborate hairstyle. Imagine hair piled 3 feet high, decorated with feathers and jewels, and sometimes even modeled ships. Yes, ships on her head. It sounds ridiculous now, but women across England copied her immediately. When Lord Stormont brought her a 4th ostrich feather from Paris in 1774, it became an overnight sensation. Every fashionable woman suddenly needed ostrich feathers. But Georgiana understood something crucial. Fashion wasn't just about vanity. Fashion was about visibility, and visibility was about power. Every time someone copied her hairstyle or her dress, they were acknowledging her influence. She was setting trends, which meant she was setting the terms of social conversation. And once you control the conversation, you can steer it wherever you want. And where Georgiana wanted to steer it was toward politics. Now, let me paint the political landscape for you, because it's important to understand what Georgiana was walking into. Britain in 1774 was technically a constitutional monarchy, but the reality was messier. King George III, yes, the one who'd lose the American colonies, had a lot of influence over Parliament. He did this through patronage, basically handing out jobs and favours to members of Parliament who'd vote the way he wanted. The Whig Party opposed this. They believed in limiting royal power, in giving Parliament more independence. The Spencer family had been Whigs for generations. And when Georgiana married into the Cavendish family, also staunch Whigs, she found herself at the centre of the opposition movement. For most aristocratic women, this would have meant exactly what we discussed earlier: hosting gatherings, facilitating connections, working behind the scenes. And Georgiana did all of that brilliantly. Devonshire House became the unofficial headquarters of the Whig Party. The drawing rooms where she hosted her salons weren't just beautiful, they were strategic command centers. She'd invite Charles James Fox, the leader of the Whig Party and one of the greatest orators of the age. She'd seat him next to a rising young politician who needed mentoring. She'd place a skeptical lord next to someone who could win him over. She'd create an atmosphere with music, wine, conversation, where political differences could be smoothed over and alliances could be built. And she did it so naturally, so charmingly, that it never looked like work. People left Devonshire House feeling like they just had a wonderful evening with friends. They didn't realize they'd been carefully managed, skillfully manipulated into forming exactly the connections Georgiana wanted them to form. But here's where Georgiana broke the mold. She didn't stay behind the scenes. She couldn't. Her personality was too big, her beliefs too passionate, her need to matter too strong. So in 1780, she did something almost unheard of. She climbed onto the hustings. That's the platform where candidates gave speeches during an election campaign and appeared publicly on behalf of Charles James Fox. The reaction was immediate and intense. People were shocked, fascinated, scandalized. Women didn't do this. Women didn't appear in public political spaces. They certainly didn't campaign for candidates, but Georgiana did it anyway. And she was electric. She was already famous, already beloved, and she used that celebrity to draw crowds. People came to see the Duchess of Devonshire. And while they are there, they heard about Whig politics, but that was just a preview. The real earthquake came in 1784. That year's election in Westminster, a prestigious London constituency, became a battleground. Charles James Fox was running, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. King George III had recently dismissed the Fox-North coalition government in a move that many saw as the king overstepping his constitutional authority. The Whigs were furious. This election was about more than one seat in Parliament. It was about whether the king could manipulate politics without consequence. And Georgiana threw herself into the campaign with an intensity that shocked everyone. She didn't just host fundraisers or make appearances. She went door to door. She walked the streets of Westminster. Imagine this, a duchess in silk and jewels walking through neighborhoods where people lived on pennies a day. And she talked to ordinary voters, she shook hands, she listened to their concerns, she asked for their support. And yes, according to the rumors that exploded across London, she kissed some of them. Now, we need to talk about this, because it became the scandal of the year. Political cartoonists had a field day. Thomas Rowlandson created a famous print called the Devincture, or Most Approved Method of Security. NG votes, showing Georgiana kissing a butcher in exchange for his vote. The implication was clear and ugly. She was using her sexuality to buy votes. Was it true? Probably not in the way the cartoon suggested, but Georgiana was affectionate, tactile, warm in a way that aristocratic women weren't supposed to be, especially not. With commoners, she probably did kiss some voters on the cheek, a gesture of gratitude, of connection. But in a world where women were supposed to be distant and untouchable, even that was revolutionary and threatening. The media onslaught was brutal. Newspapers ran stories suggesting she was trading sexual favors for votes. Political opponents accused her of impropriety, of degrading herself and her position. Her own mother, Countess Spencer, begged her to step back, to stop humiliating the family. But Georgiana wouldn't quit. She believed in Fox, believed in the Whig cause, and she understood that her fame gave her a platform that could actually make a difference. So she kept campaigning. She endured the mockery, the cartoons, the vicious gossip. She showed up day after day, even as blisters formed on her feet, from walking the streets in those elegant but impractical shoes aristocratic women wore. And on election day, Charles James Fox won, by a narrow margin, just 198 votes, but he won. Georgiana had helped pull off an upset victory against a candidate supported by the king himself. Think about what this means. A woman who couldn't vote, who had no official political role whatsoever, had helped determine the outcome of one of the most important elections of the decade. She'd proven that celebrity and charisma could translate into political power. She'd shown that women could shape politics, not just through behind-the-scenes influence, but through direct public action. It was revolutionary, and it terrified people. After the election, Georgiana retreated from public political life for a while. The backlash had been too intense, the personal cost too high. But she didn't stop being politically influential. She just went back to wielding power the way women were supposed to, through her salon, through her connections, through careful conversations over dinner. But now everyone knew what she was capable of. And that changed everything. Because here's the thing about Georgiana, that made her different from almost every other woman of her time. She couldn't be invisible. Her personality was too vibrant, her presence too magnetic. Even when she tried to fade into the background, she glowed. People were drawn to her. They wanted her approval, her attention, her friendship, and she used that not cynically. I don't think Georgiana had a cynical bone in her body, but instinctively she surrounded herself with the most interesting people in England. Her salon at Devonshire House became legendary. On any given evening, you might find the Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, sitting next to playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan. The poet and politician Edmund Burke might be debating philosophy with artist Joshua Reynolds. Politicians, artists, writers, intellectuals, they all orbited around Georgiana. She created this atmosphere where ideas could flow freely, where politics mixed with art and literature and science. It wasn't stuffy or formal. It was exciting. People came to Devonshire House not just to see and be seen, but because genuinely interesting things happened there. And in the middle of it all sat Georgiana, making everyone feel brilliant and important, steering conversations, forming connections, shaping opinions. She had this gift for making political maneuvering feel like friendship, for making strategic networking feel like genuine warmth. And maybe it was genuine. Maybe that's what made her so effective. She actually cared about people. But let me ask you something. What do you think it cost her? All this performing, all this constant visibility, all this pressure to be perfect and charming and influential every single moment. We'll see the price she paid soon enough. But even at the height of her power, even when she seemed to have it all, fame, influence, access to the most exciting circles in Britain, something was breaking inside her. Because here's what nobody talks about. When they tell Georgiana's story, she was lonely. Her husband didn't love her, barely seemed to like her. Honestly, she'd suffered multiple miscarriages trying to produce that crucial male heir, each one a private trauma she had to endure while maintaining a perfect public facade. And the same qualities that made her powerful, her warmth, her openness, her emotional generosity, also made her vulnerable. Georgiana gave and gave. She gave her time, her energy, her political capital. She gave emotional support to friends, strategic advice to politicians, financial help to anyone who asked, and many people asked because she could never say no. She was building this empire of influence, but the foundation was cracking, and into those cracks would come complications that would nearly destroy her. Gambling, debts that spiraled into catastrophic territory, a love affair that would produce a secret child, a friendship that would become a bizarre, painful manager right under her own roof. But we're getting ahead of ourselves right now. In 1784, Georgiana is at her peak. She's 27 years old. She's one of the most famous women in England. She's proven that a woman can shape politics, can command attention, can matter in ways that society says women aren't supposed to matter. She's become the template for a new kind of aristocratic woman, not content to sit quietly in the background, but determined to use every advantage, every tool, every gift to make an impact. And she's not alone, because Mayfair is full of women watching Georgiana, learning from her, adapting her strategies to their own purposes. Some of them will surpass her in cunning. Some will wield power more carefully, more strategically. Some will avoid the scandals and the suffering that eventually consume Georgiana. But none of them will burn quite as brightly. None will be quite as beloved, quite as revolutionary, quite as unforgettable as Georgiana Spencer Cavendish, the Duchess of Devonshire, who kissed butchers for votes and changed British politics forever. Now, you might be wondering, who were these other women? Who else was playing this game at the highest levels? Well, there was one woman who watched Georgiana's rise with great interest, a woman who was everything. Georgiana wasn't calculating where Georgiana was impulsive, cold where Georgiana was warm, strategic where Georgiana was passionate. Her name was Lady Melbourne, and where Georgiana won hearts, Lady Melbourne collected leverage. She understood something Georgiana never quite grasped. In Mayfair's game of shadows, the most dangerous players were the ones you underestimated, and nobody ever saw Lady Melbourne coming until it was far too late. Picture walking into a grand ballroom and immediately sensing that someone is watching you. Not obviously, nothing so crude as staring, but you feel it. A subtle assessment happening behind elegant composure, someone calculating your value, your weaknesses, your usefulness. That was the feeling people got when they met Elizabeth Milbank Lamb Vick Countess Melbourne. And if you were smart, you paid very close attention to that feeling, because Lady Melbourne was the most dangerous woman in London, and she made her power look effortless. Here's what's fascinating about Lady Melbourne. She wasn't born to the highest aristocracy. She wasn't breathtakingly beautiful like Georgiana. She didn't have natural charisma that made everyone fall in love with her. What she had was something far more valuable. She had a mind like a chess master and absolutely no illusions about how the world worked. Elizabeth Milbank was born in 1751 in Yorkshire, the daughter of a baronet, comfortable, respectable, but not spectacular. Her father had some political connections. He'd been a member of Parliament, and her mother's father had been politically active as well. So, Elizabeth grew up understanding power, watching how it operated, learning its rhythms and rules, and she was smart, wickedly smart. She was educated privately, which meant at home, like most girls of her class, but while other girls were learning just enough French and music to be marriageable, Elizabeth was paying attention to something else entirely. She was studying people, how they thought, what they wanted, how they could be influenced. It was like she was born understanding something. It takes most people a lifetime to learn. Everyone wants something, and if you can figure out what that is, you can control them. At 17, Elizabeth made a strategic marriage that would define everything that came after. She married Penistone Lamb, a baronet who was absolutely loaded. His father had been a merchant, trade, not aristocracy, and had made an absolute fortune. Penistone inherited wealth that many dukes would envy. But here's the thing. New money wasn't the same as old blood. Penistone had the wealth, but not quite the social position. Elizabeth had better lineage, but needed the money. So they made a deal, basically. She brought £10,000 and good family connections. He brought massive wealth and ambition. They married on April 13, 1769, and immediately moved to London, where Elizabeth set about becoming indispensable to the Whig party. And she was brilliant at it. Within just a few years, Melbourne House in Whitehall, their London residence, became one of the most important political salons in Britain. But here's where Lady Melbourne differed fundamentally from Georgiana. She never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be famous or beloved. She wanted to be powerful. And she understood that real power works best in shadows. Let me tell you how her mind worked, because it's genuinely fascinating. When the young Georgiana Spencer married the Duke of Devonshire in 1774 and became an instant celebrity, most people in Lady Melbourne's position would have seen her as a rival. Here was a woman, younger, higher ranking, more beautiful, who could potentially eclipse Melbourne House's importance in Whig circles. But Lady Melbourne looked at Georgiana and saw opportunity. She recognized immediately that having Georgiana as a friend would be far more valuable than having her as a competitor. So Lady Melbourne cultivated Georgiana, became her confidant and advisor. And it worked. The two women became close. They were even painted together along with sculptor Andamer in a rather cheeky portrait as the three witches from MCBTH stirring a cauldron. Hick tells you something about how people saw them, doesn't it? Powerful women have always made people nervous. While Georgiana poured her heart into everything she did, Lady Melbourne kept hers carefully locked away. Shibra elected information the way some people collect art. She remembered everything, every scandal, every debt, very secret affair, every political misstep. And she filed it all away for potential future use. Do you know what Byron called her later? The best friend ever had in my life. This is Lord Byron. We're talking about the poet, He romantic, the rebel, and he trusted Lady Melbourne more than anyone. Shibra became his confidant during his catastrophic affair with her daughter-in-law, Lady Caroline Lamb, and that tells you everything about Lady Melbourne's particular genius. She could make even someone as wild as Byron feel understood, could give advice that seemed genuinely caring while always serving her own interests. But I'm getting ahead of the story again. Let's go back to the 1770s and 1780s when Lady Melbourne was building her empire. Melbourne House wasn't as grand as Devonshire House. It didn't have the same architectural splendor or artistic treasures, but it had something just as valuable. It had discipline. Lady Melbourne ran her salon like a military operation. Every gathering was carefully planned. Every guest list was strategic. She knew exactly who needed to meet whom, which alliances needed strengthening, which egos needed stroking, and she was ruthless about it. If you were useful to the Whig party or to her family's interests, you were welcome at Melbourne House. If you weren't, you simply stopped receiving invitations. No explanation, no second chances, you were out. This is so different from Georgiana's approach. Georgiana invited people because she liked them, because they were interesting because she wanted to help them. Lady Melbourne invited people because they served a purpose, and the moment they stopped serving that purpose, they ceased to exist in her world. Now here's where things get complicated, and we need to talk about it because it shaped everything. Lady Melbourne had affairs, lots of them, with some of the most powerful men in Britain. And this wasn't scandalous in the way you might think, because she was incredibly discreet about it. She understood the rules of aristocratic society perfectly. You could do almost anything as long as you didn't get caught, didn't make it public, and didn't embarrass the family name. Her husband Peniston, who was made Vic, Count Melbourne in 1770, and then raised to a UK peerage as Baron Melbourne in 1781, either didn't know or didn't care. He was focused on his political career, and Lady Melbourne's social success helped him enormously, so he looked the other way while she conducted relationships with men like George Wyndham, the 3rd Earl of Egremont, and Francis Russell, the 5th Duke of Bedford, and most dramatically, George, the Prince of Wales himself, the future King of England. Here's what makes this particularly interesting. Lady Melbourne had 6 children, and there's considerable historical debate about who actually fathered them. Her first son, Peniston, probably was her husband's, but after that, her second son, William, who had become Prime Minister and Queen Victoria's closest advisor, was almost certainly fathered by Lord Egremont. Her daughter Emily, also probably. Her son Frederick could have been any number of men, and her youngest son George. Strong evidence suggests his father was the Prince of Wales. Now, you might be thinking, how did she get away with this? How did her husband not object? How did society not condemn her? The answer reveals something crucial about how power worked in George and England. Aristocratic marriages weren't about love or even fidelity. They were about property, inheritance, and maintaining the family line. As long as Lady Melbourne was discreet, and she was always discreet, and as long as her husband officially acknowledged the children as his, which he did, then technically everything was proper. The children would inherit the Lamb name and fortune. Her husband's political career benefited from her social connections, and everyone preserved the appearance of respectability. Lady Melbourne herself famously said, "No man is safe with another's secrets, and no woman with her own." Think about that. She understood that the key to power wasn't just knowing secrets. It was knowing which secrets to keep and which to strategically reveal. And she taught this to her children, well, to most of them. Her sons absorbed her lessons in political maneuvering. Her daughter Emily became one of the patronesses of Olmax and conducted her own discreet affair with Lord Palmerston that lasted decades. They eventually married after Emily's husband died, but her daughter-in-law, Caroline Lamb, never learned, and the conflict between Lady Melbourne and Caroline would become one of the great dramas of the Regency period. But that comes later. What I want you to understand right now is how Lady Melbourne operated at the peak of her power. While Georgiana was the public face of Whig society, beloved and celebrated, Lady Melbourne was the machinery making everything work. She wasn't interested in being loved. She wanted to be necessary, and politicians came to Melbourne House not just for the social atmosphere, but because Lady Melbourne could tell them who was in favor, who was falling out of favor, who could be trusted, who needed to be watched. She had information that the official party leaders didn't have because people told her things. They confided in her because she seemed sympathetic, because she was such a good listener, because she never appeared to judge. But she was always judging, always calculating, always adding to her mental ledger of debts and obligations and leverage points. Charles James Fox, the leader of the Whig Party, relied on her counsel. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the brilliant playwright and politician, valued her friendship. Even the Prince of Wales, who would become Prince Regent and eventually King George IV, trusted her judgment. She had relationships with all the most important men in Whig politics, and she used those relationships to advance her family's interests with laissez-faire. Her primary goal, the thing that drove everything else, was securing positions for her sons, particularly William, her second son, whom she had marked from childhood as destined for great things. She maneuvered tirelessly to get him into Parliament, to get him the right appointments, to ensure he had the connections and opportunities he needed to rise. And it worked. William Lamb would eventually become Prime Minister, one of the most important political figures of the 19th century. But here's what's both impressive and slightly chilling about Lady Melbourne. She loved her children fiercely, would do anything for them, but even that love was channeled through strategic thinking. When her son William wanted to marry Lady Caroline Ponenby, Georgiana's niece, Lady Melbourne had serious reservations. She knew Caroline was emotionally volatile, potentially unstable. She knew this marriage could cause problems, but she also knew that Caroline was connected to two of the most powerful Whig families in Britain, the Ponsonbys and the Candishes. Marriage to Caroline would cement William's position in Whig society. So Lady Melbourne approved the match even though her instincts screamed warnings. She chose strategy over intuition, and she would regret it for the rest of her life. Now I want you to consider something. What do you think it was like to be Lady Melbourne? To live your entire life calculating, strategizing, never letting your guard down, never trusting anyone completely. She had lovers, but no real intimacy. These relationships were transactional, about power and position. She had friends, but no genuine confidence. She was too busy being everyone else's confidant to have one herself. Even her relationship with her children was filtered through ambition. Was she lonely? The historical record doesn't tell us. Lady Melbourne wasn't the type to write emotional letter or confide her feelings to a diary. She was far too controlled for that. But I wonder sometimes if behind that cool, calculating exterior there was a woman who wished she could just be without always performing, always strategizing, always playing the game. Or maybe not. Maybe she genuinely loved the game. Maybe manipulating people and situations gave her the same thrill that fashion gave Georgiana, or poetry gave Byron. Maybe she looked at the social and political world as a massive puzzle, and she got satisfaction from solving it, from making the pieces fit together in ways that served her purposes. What we know for certain is that she was extraordinarily effective. Melbourne House remained a center of Whig power for more than 40 years. Lady Melbourne herself stayed politically influential until her death in 1818. She survived scandals that would have destroyed other women, navigated political upheavals that ended other careers, and left behind children who achieved everything she'd hoped for them. But she paid a price. Everyone always pays a price. Lady Melbourne's reputation then and now is complicated. People respected her, but also feared her. They valued her friendship, but also knew it was conditional. When she died after a long and painful illness from rheumatism, her loved ones were distressed. But the tributes weren't warm. Nobody called her kind or generous or beloved. They called her clever, powerful, influential. Is that enough? I don't know. What do you think? If you could have Lady Melbourne's power but at the cost of emotional connection, would you take that deal? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because we like to think we'd choose love over power, warmth over influence. But Lady Melbourne made the opposite choice deliberately and repeatedly, and she built something that lasted. The fascinating thing is that Georgiana and Lady Melbourne needed each other. Georgiana provided the glamour, the public face, the emotional appeal that won hearts. Lady Melbourne provided the structure, the strategy, the ruthless pragmatism that actually got things done. Together they made the Whig Party's social machinery work. Separately, neither would have been as effective, and they both knew it, which is why their friendship, unlikely as it was, endured. The romantic and the pragmatist, the heart and the brain, the star and the shadow. But here's the thing about shadows. They're cast by light, and in Mayfair, there were places where even the combined power of Georgiana and Lady Melbourne couldn't reach, places where a different kind of authority reigned supreme. 7 women who met every Monday night during the season to decide who belonged in society and who didn't. 7 women who could destroy your life with a single signature, or rather with the absence of one. They were called the Lady Patronesses of Almack's. And in our next part, you're about to discover why even dukes trembled at their decisions. There's a piece of paper sitting in the Huntington Library in California that once had the power to make or break lives. It's about the size of a modern greeting card printed on cream-colored paper with elegant script. At the top it reads Almack's, and below that, a date in April 1817. At the bottom, 2 initials, M.D., probably standing for Mary, Marchioness of Downshire, one of the Lady Patronesses. This little slip of paper, this voucher, was the key to heaven, or at least to what passed for heaven in Regency London, and if you didn't have one, you might as well have been invisible. Welcome to the most exclusive club in Britain, where entry cost 10 guineas, but couldn't be bought with all the money in the world. Where the Duke of Wellington himself was turned away at the door for arriving 7 minutes late, where 300 officers of the FO, OT guards, competed desperately for half a dozen spaces, where a single rejection could mean social death and an invitation could launch a dynasty. Welcome to Almack's Assembly Rooms, and welcome to the power of the 7 women who controlled it. Absolutely. Let me set the scene for you, because you need to understand just how bizarre this situation was. We're talking about a venue on King Street in St. James's. Not particularly large, not especially beautiful. The refreshments were famously terrible. Stale cake, weak lemonade, tea that had been sitting too long. No alcohol was served because the patronesses wanted to maintain an atmosphere of perfect propriety. The dancing was sedate, country dances and cotillions, nothing too exciting. At 11, supper was served, and after that, the doors were locked. Didn't matter who you were. If you arrived at 11:01, you were out of luck. So why did everyone care so desperately about getting in? Because Almack's wasn't about the food or the dancing or the building. It was about being seen, being approved, being included in the most select circle in British society. An Almack's voucher wasn't just permission to attend Wednesday night balls during the season. It was proof that you belonged to the elite of the elite, that you had breeding, manners, and most importantly, that the right people considered you acceptable. Captain Grow, an army officer who wrote extensively about Regency society, said it perfectly. At the present time, one can hardly conceive the importance which was attached to getting admission to Almack's, the 7th heaven of the fashionable world. The 7th heaven. That's not hyperbole. That's how people genuinely felt about it. And here's the most remarkable part. This entire system, this mechanism that could elevate nobodies and destroy aristocrats, was controlled by 6 or 7 women, just women. No men had any official role in deciding who got vouchers. No government body, no royal authority, no official institution. Just a small committee of lady patronesses who met every Monday evening during the season and decided with absolute power who was in and who was out. Think about that for a moment. In a world where women couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't officially control anything, these 7 women had more social power than the king himself. Because the king could make you a lord, but he couldn't make you fashionable. He couldn't force the ton high society to accept you. Only the lady patronesses could do that. So who were these women? Let me introduce you to the committee as it stood in 1814 at the height of Almack's power, and I want you to notice something as we go through them. Every single one was young. Most were in their 22nd or early 32nd. This wasn't a group of elderly dowagers making judgments from on high. These were women in the prime of their lives, and they wielded their authority with the confidence of absolute monarchs. First, Lady Castlereagh. She was married to Viscount Castlereagh, who was Foreign Secretary and one of the most powerful men in government. But interestingly, Lady Castlereagh herself wasn't known for being particularly charming or witty. What she had was impeccable breeding and absolute certainty about who belonged in her world and who didn't. She was formal, proper, slightly intimidating. Cross her, and you are finished. Then there was Lady Jersey. Now this is Sarah Villiers, Countess of Jersey, and we need to be clear here because her mother-in-law, Frances, Lady Jersey, was one of the Prince of Wales's notorious mistresses. Sarah was determined to distance herself from that scandal. She was young, married at 19, and she played the role of virtuous guardian of morality with theatrical intensity. Captain Groof described her as a theatrical tragedy quay. N, who, whilst attempting the sublime, frequently made herself simply ridiculous, being inconceivably rude, and in her manner often ill-bred. A harsh, right? But that rudeness was strategic. Lady Jersey wasn't interested in being liked. She was interested in being feared, and it worked. Next, Lady Cowper. This was Emily Lamb. Yes, Lady Melbourne's daughter, the one we mentioned before. Emily had all of her mother's intelligence, but with a lighter touch. She was genuinely charming, genuinely kind, and Grow called her the most popular of all the patronesses. But don't mistake kindness for weakness. Emily learned from her mother. She knew exactly what she was doing, and beneath that warm exterior was steel. Then there's Lady Septon. Maria Molyneux, Countess of Septon, was known for being more relaxed than the others, more willing to bend the rules occasionally. But again, this was relative. She still had the power to destroy you, and she knew it. Mrs. Drummond Burle, later Lady Willoughby Dearesby, was the most exclusive of them all. She made the others look permissive. If you wanted an example of aristocratic or of absolute conviction in one's own superiority, Miss Drummond Burle was it. She looked at most of humanity the way you might look at something unpleasant on your shoe. And then there were the two foreign patronesses. Yes, they allowed foreigners into this very English institution, which tells you something about how power actually worked. Princess Ashazi was Austrian, married to the Austrian ambassador. She was small, lively, somewhat sharp-tongued. Grow called her a bonfong, good-natured, but also noted she was somewhat spiteful and always needed to be the center of attention. Finally, Countess Levin, Dorothea Levin, wife of the Russian ambassador. She was the first foreigner ever elected as a patroness, and she was formidable, brilliant, cultured, politically astute. She had genuine influence on international affairs through her husband's position, but she also loved the social power that Almax gave her. Princess Levin described her as small, round, black, animated, but with a tendency towards spite. These 7 women, different personalities, different strengths. Sometimes they didn't even like each other, but together they formed what was essentially an oligarchy ruled by a small elite group, and they ran it with iron discipline. So how did it actually work? Let me walk you through the process because it's fascinating in its simplicity and its cruelty. First, you had to be proposed for membership. Usually someone already on the list would recommend you. Then every Monday night the patronesses would meet and review applications. They discuss each candidate. What family were they from? What was their reputation? Had there been any scandals? Were they properly connected? Did they have good manners? And here's the thing, there were no written rules, no published criteria. The patronesses decided based on their collective judgment, which meant their personal whims if one of them had taken a dislike to your mother 30 years ago. You might be rejected. If you'd worn the wrong dress to the wrong party, you might be rejected. If they simply felt you didn't quite fit, you were rejected. If you were rejected, you received a printed circular with a blank space where your name was filled in. It said something like the ladies' patronesses' compliments to Mr. or Ms. so-and-so, but regret they cannot comply with your application. No explanation, no appeal, no second chance, and everyone would know. That was the devastating part. When those circulars went out, word spread immediately through London society. You'd been rejected from Almax. You were effectively socially dead. But if you were accepted, Then you could purchase your voucher for 10 guineas. The voucher entitled you to attend the Wednesday night balls for a specified period, usually a month or the entire season. And once you had that voucher, you'd been validated. The patronesses had looked at you and deemed you worthy. Every door in society would open. Now you might think, surely wealth could buy your way in. Surely if you were rich enough, they'd make an exception. No, absolutely not. In fact, the patronesses took particular pleasure in excluding the wealthy, but common merchants, no matter how rich, were generally barred. Nabobs, that's what they called British. People who'd made fortunes in India were looked down upon. Anyone who'd made money in trade, in business, in anything other than land ownership was suspect. There's a story that perfectly illustrates this. A wealthy merchant offered an absolutely enormous sum. We're talking enough to buy a fleet of ships for vouchers for his daughters. The patronesses didn't even bother to respond officially. They simply never sent the vouchers. The message was clear. Your money means nothing here. This is about blood, breeding, and our approval, and you don't have it. Can you imagine the psychology of this? If you were a young woman making your debut in society, an Almack's voucher was everything. Your entire future, your marriage prospects, your social standing, your family's reputation could hinge on whether these 7 women decided to grant you access. And they knew it. They absolutely knew the power they held, and they used it deliberately. This wasn't accidental. This was a carefully maintained system of social control, and it worked because everyone agreed to play along. If the town as a whole had decided Almack's didn't matter, it would have collapsed. But they didn't. They bought into the system, completely, which gave the patronesses ultimate authority. Let me give you some specific examples of how this played out, because the stories are incredible. The Duke of Wellington, yes, the military hero who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, one of the most famous and powerful men in Britain, arrived at Talmack's one evening at 11:07. Lady Jersey was at the door. She looked at her watch, looked at the Duke, and refused him entry. The Duke of Wellington, standing outside like a schoolboy, denied permission to enter a party. He had to leave, humiliated because the rules were the rules and the patronesses enforced them absolutely. Or consider this, in 1817, the Marquis and Marchioness of something or other. The newspapers at the time used initials to preserve some discretion, along with their daughter arrived at Almack's without their tickets, just forgotten them. They were well known, absolutely unquestionable in terms of breeding and status, but they didn't have the physical tickets. The patronesses politely but firmly asked them to leave, and they did. They submitted to the authority of these women because to challenge it would have been to challenge the entire social order. The rules extended beyond just attendance. There was a dress code, and it was enforced rigorously. Gentlemen had to wear knee breeches, not trousers. Knee breeches. This became a point of contention as fashions changed and trousers became more popular for evening wear. But the patronesses didn't care about fashion trends. They cared about maintaining standards. In 1819, they issued what was essentially a decree. An order has been issued, we understand, by the lady patronesses of Almack's to prevent the admission of gentlemen in trousers and C-sex to the bulls on Wednesdays, at the same time allowing an exception to those gentlemen who may be knocked or otherwise deformed. Read that. Again, they'd allow trousers if you were physically deformed because presumably you couldn't fit into knee breeches, but otherwise absolutely not. The gentlemen of London were not pleased, but they complied because what choice did they have? Now, here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Why did this system have such power? Why did rational, accomplished adults submit to the arbitrary judgments of 7 women, most of whom had no achievements beyond being born into the right families and marrying well? The answer is about scarcity and validation. Humans are wired to value what's scarce. If anyone could get into Almack's, nobody would care about it. But because it was so exclusive, because rejection was so common, acceptance became incredibly valuable. It became a signal not just to others, but to yourself that you truly belonged at the top of society. And there's something else at work here, something darker. The patronesses could have been more inclusive. They could have used their power to make society more open, more meritocratic, but they didn't because their power depended on exclusion. The moment they let everyone in, their authority would evaporate. They had to keep people out to maintain their position at the center of the gate. So they created this perpetual anxiety. You could have a voucher this season and lose it the next if you committed some minor social infraction. You were never safe, never secure. You always had to be watching your behavior, monitoring your reputation, because the patronesses were always watching, always judging, always ready to withdraw their approval. It's psychological control at its most refined, and these women, young as they were, understood it instinctively. What's also fascinating is how they dealt with each other. Because remember, these 7 women didn't always agree. They had different standards, different priorities, different people they wanted to protect or punish. How did they resolve conflicts? We don't have detailed records of their Monday night meetings, but we know that sometimes they'd compromise. One patroness would agree to accept someone she didn't like, if another patroness agreed to reject someone she'd wanted to include. It was negotiation, horse trading, political maneuvering, just like the men in Parliament, except happening in a private room with no official record. And sometimes they'd use their power vindictively. When Lady Caroline Lamb, remember her from earlier, Lady Melbourne's daughter-in-law, published her novel Glenavon that satirized Lady Jersey took immediate revenge. She had Caroline banned from Almack's. It was the ultimate social punishment. Caroline was publicly humiliated, effectively stating that she was no longer acceptable in the best circles. Later, Caroline's sister-in-law, Lady Cowper, one of the patronesses, managed to get the ban lifted, but the damage was done. Everyone knew that Lady Jersey had the power to exclude even someone from one of the most prominent Whig families in Britain. The message was clear: cross us at your peril. By the early 1820s, Almack's was at its absolute peak of influence. A contemporary observer wrote, "The lady patronesses have the power by their single fiat of making or unmaking entire families. They can open or shut the doors of fashionable life on them by the mere circumstance of giving or withholding a ticket to Almack's. The proudest and most aristocratic family in the land are fain to bow down and with cap in hand, to use a homely but expressive phrase, supplicate a subscription from this coalition cabal." A coalition cabal, that's what they called it, and it's accurate. These women formed a cartel that monopolized access to high society, and they used that monopoly ruthlessly. But here's the question I want to leave you with. Were they wrong to do it? Before you answer, consider this. They were operating in a RLD, where they had almost no official power. They couldn't vote, couldn't own property, couldn't pursue careers. The only power available to them was social power. So they took it and maximized it. They created a system where they mattered, where they made decisions that affected people's lives, where they couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Yes, it was arbitrary. Yes, it was often cruel. Yes, it reinforced class hierarchies and kept talented people out while letting mediocre aristocrats in. But it was also one of the few spaces in British society where women held absolute authority, where men had to submit to their judgment, where female opinions determined outcomes. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying it's complicated. These women took the constraints placed on them and turned them into weapons. They played the only game available to them, and they won it so completely that their names are still remembered 2 centuries later. But every system eventually crumbles. Almack's power wouldn't last forever. By the 1830s, things would start to change, but we're not there yet. Right now, in the peak years, the patronesses reign supreme, and everyone in Mayfair society knows it. What we haven't talked about yet, what's been lurking under the surface of all these stories, is what happened when the careful façades cracked, when the pressure of maintaining perfection became too much, when the personal lives of these powerful women collided with their public roles in ways that couldn't be managed or hidden, because behind the silk and the elegance and the power, there were human beings, messy, complicated, suffering human beings. And some of their stories are going to break your heart, starting with what happened inside Devonshire House when friendship, love, and desperation created the strangest household arrangement in British aristocratic history. What would you do if the people you loved most in the world brought their lover to live in your house? Not for a visit permanently, to sleep down the hall from you, to join you for breakfast, to sit beside you at dinner, parties. And what if everyone knew? What if this arrangement became the talk of London, whispered about in drawing rooms, immortalized in satirical cartoons? Would you endure it? Could you? Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, lived this reality for 25 years. And the most extraordinary part, she loved both of them, her husband and his mistress. She couldn't escape them, so she created something historians still struggle to categorize, a household held together by desperation, affection, jealousy, and a bizarre kind of family loyalty that defied every convention of the time. This is the story of the Manigatas at Devonshire House, and I need to tell it to you carefully because it's easy to make it sound like a scandalous soap opera. But what it really was, what it really reveals, is how trapped these women were and how they created survival strategies that looked nothing like what we'd choose today. Let's go back to 1782. Georgiana has been married for 8 years. She's 25 years old, famous, influential, beloved by society. But her marriage is a disaster, not publicly. Publicly everything looks fine, but privately, the Duke of Devonshire barely speaks to her. He's cold, indifferent, more interested in his mistresses than in his wife, and worse, far worse, Georgiana still hasn't produced a male heir. She'd suffered multiple miscarriages by this point, each one a private trauma, a physical and emotional agony, and each one reinforced her failure in the eyes of society because that was her primary job. Remember, to produce a son, to continue the Cavendish line. She'd given birth to a daughter in 1777 who died within hours. Another daughter, Georgiana, they called her Little G, was born in 1783 and survived. But daughters didn't count. She needed a son. The pressure was destroying her, and she was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely. Her husband was absent emotionally and often physically. She had friends, admirers, a whole social world orbiting around her. But at the end of the day, she went home to cold bedrooms and colder conversations, and then she met Elizabeth Foster. Lady Elizabeth Foster, everyone called her. Bess was 23 years old when she entered Georgiana's life in 1782. She was beautiful, with delicate features and enormous eyes that always seemed a little sad. She was also in trouble. She'd married young to an Irish member of Parliament named John Foster, and the marriage had been terrible. He was controlling, possibly violent, definitely unkind. They'd had 2 sons, but when the marriage fell apart, her husband took them away from her. Just took them because he could, because legally he owned them. Bess found herself alone, separated but not divorced because divorce was nearly impossible and essentially peniles. She had no income, no home, no prospects. She was dependent on the charity of friends and family. When she met Georgiana, she must have seemed like salvation itself. And Georgiana, who had the biggest heart of anyone in London, immediately wanted to help. She invited Bess to stay at Devonshire House, just temporarily, just until Bess could figure out her situation. Except Bess never left. She lived at Devonshire House for the next 24 years. Now here's where it gets complicated, because somewhere in those first few months, Bess became the Duke of Devonshire's mistress. We don't know exactly when it happened. Some historians think Georgiana actually encouraged it, hoping that if her husband was happy with his mistress, he'd be kinder to her. Other historians think Bess seduced the Duke, deliberately, seeing an opportunity to secure her position. The truth is probably messier than either explanation. What we do know is that by 1783 the arrangement was established. The Duke, Georgiana, and Bess lived together. The Duke divided his time between the 2 women, and somehow, impossibly, Georgiana and Bess remained friends, close friends. Some historians even suggest they may have been lovers themselves, though the evidence is ambiguous. Try to imagine the emotional gymnastics required to make this work. Georgiana had to watch the man she'd married, the man she'd tried so hard to please prefer someone else, had to know that when he left her room he was going to Bess's, had to smile through dinners, where the three of them sat together making conversation as if this were a normal household. But here's the thing that's easy to miss if you're looking at this from a modern perspective. Georgiana needed Bess, not just emotionally, though she did desperately. Bess became her closest confidant, the person who understood her struggles, who provided companionship and sympathy, but also strategically. Because as long as Bess was the Duke's mistress, he was less likely to take up with someone else, someone who might be hostile to Georgiana, who might try to turn the Duke against her, who might threaten her position. Better the mistress you know who's also your friend than some unknown woman who might destroy you. It's pragmatic, heartbreaking but pragmatic, and it shows you how limited Georgiana's options were. She couldn't leave the marriage. Divorce would have meant social death and losing access to her children. She couldn't force the Duke to love her or be faithful. All she could do was manage the situation as best she could, and if that meant accepting his mistress as a permanent member of the household, then that's what she did. Bess played her role perfectly. She styled herself as poor little Bess Alwa. Once grateful, always helpful, always indispensable. She took on household duties that Georgiana found burdensome. She was there when Georgiana needed someone to talk to. She nursed Georgiana through illnesses. She acted as mediator between Georgiana and the Duke when tensions ran high, and all the while she was securing her own position. Bess had children with the Duke. Two of them, Caroline and Augustus, both born in secret and raised as the Duke's wards. Everyone knew whose children they really were, but the polite fiction was maintained. The children even grew up alongside Georgiana's children, one big blended family held together by denial and desperation. Can you imagine the family dinners? Picture it. Georgiana at one end of the table, the Duke at the other, Bess beside him, the children, some Georgian, some Besses scattered around the table, everyone pretending this is normal. This is fine. This is just how aristocratic families work. And here's the most disturbing part. It kind of was normal, not the living arrangement exactly. That was unusual even for the time, but the existence of mistresses, the acceptance of infidelity, the wife's complete inability to do anything about it. That was standard. Georgiana's situation was just more visible, more dramatic than most. Other wives dealt with their husbands' affairs by ignoring them, by maintaining separate lives, by taking their own lovers in revenge. But Georgiana couldn't ignore it because Bess was right there every day, impossible to avoid. And Georgiana couldn't take revenge because her heart wouldn't let her. She genuinely cared about Bess. It's one of the most psychologically complex relationships in all of British aristocratic history. In 1784, something happened that should have changed everything. Georgiana finally had an affair of her own with a young, rising politician named Charles Grey. Yes, that Les Grey, the one who'd later become Prime Minister and have Earl Gay tea named after him. He was 20, handsome, idealistic, passionate about Whig politics, and he fell completely in love with Georgiana. For the first time in her marriage, Georgiana experienced what it felt like to be genuinely desired, not for her family connections or her social position or her ability to produce heirs, just for herself. Grey loved her intelligence, her warmth, her political passion. He wrote her poetry. He sought her advice. He made her feel seen in a way the Duke never had. And Georgiana fell for him completely. This wasn't a strategic liaison or a meaningless flirtation. This was real love, probably the deepest love of her life, and it destroyed her. Because in 1792, Georgiana got pregnant. Not with the Duke's child, with Grey's. The timing made it impossible to claim otherwise, And this was the one thing that couldn't be managed, couldn't be smoothed over, couldn't be absorbed into the strange household arrangement they'd built. The scandal would have been catastrophic, not just for Georgiana, but for the entire Whig party. Grey was a rising political star. The Duke of Devonshire was one of the party's chief financial backers. Georgiana was the party's most visible social asset. A pregnancy from an affair would destroy all of them. So, the Duke made a decision. Georgiana would go abroad immediately. She would have the baby in secret, give it up, and return to England as if nothing had happened. Grey would have no contact with the child. No one could ever know, and Georgiana agreed. What choice did she have? Refusing would have meant losing everything. Her other children, her position, her entire life. So in late 1792, heavily pregnant, Georgiana left England. She took Bess with her as companion. Think about that. She took her husband's mistress with her to give birth to her Vez child because she had no one else, because Bess was the only person she trusted. They went to France first, then to Switzerland. The journey was difficult, dangerous even. This was during the French Revolution, and aristocrats were being arrested and executed across France, but they made it to a small town in the south of France. And there, on February 20th, 1793, Georgiana gave birth to a daughter. They named her Eliza, and then they took her away. Georgiana held her baby for just a few days before giving her to Grey's family to raise. The child would grow up knowing Georgiana as a distant family friend, never as her mother. Grey would see his daughter occasionally, but never as a father, just as uncle. Georgiana returned to England in September 1793. She'd been gone 9 months. Everyone knew why, even if no one said it openly. She came back thinner, sadder, quieter. Something fundamental had broken inside her. She'd sacrificed her child to save her position, and that choice haunted her for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Bess was still there, still living at Devonshire House, still the Duke's mistress, still Georgiana's friend and tormentor. Can you imagine coming home from that trauma to find your husband's mistress waiting for you, knowing that you'd confided everything to this woman during your exile, knowing that she knew your deepest pain? The household continued as before. The strange triangle persisted. From the outside, it probably looked like Georgiana had everything: title, wealth, influence, fame. But inside Devonshire House, she was trapped in an arrangement that required her to deny her own feelings constantly, to smile through pain, to accept what couldn't be changed. And she did it for 13 more years. She maintained the household, maintained her role, maintained the facade. She never saw Grey as a lover again. That relationship was finished. Thaug. They remained friendly from a distance. She continued hosting her salons, continued her political work, continued being the public face of Whig society. But the cost was immense. She started gambling compulsively, losing staggering amounts of money. At one point, her debts reached something like $64,000, approximately 353 to 4 million in today's money. She was drinking heavily, taking laudanum, the opium-based painkiller that every fashionable woman used, but that she was using more and more frequently. She was slowly destroying herself. In 1796, she developed an abscess in her eye. It was treated badly, and the infection spread to her other eye. For a while, she was nearly blind. She recovered, somewhat, but she was left partially sighted for the rest of her life. The woman who'd been celebrated for her beauty, who'd set fashion trends, who'd commanded attention wherever she went, could barely see. She had to wear heavy spectacles and stay out of bright light. It must have felt like a metaphor for her entire existence, seeing everything, but never quite clearly, never quite able to control what was happening around her. Through all of this, Bess remained helpful, solicitous, indispensable, and Georgiana remained dependent on her, even though part of her must have resented Bess terribly. Because that's the truly cruel part of their relationship. Georgiana couldn't afford to lose Bess. She needed her friendship. needed the stability best, provided, needed someone who understood the bizarre household they'd created. So the triangle persisted until 1806 when Georgiana died. She was only 48 years old. Her health had been declining for years. The gambling stress, the drinking, the lordom, the eye problems, the emotional exhaustion of living the way she'd lived. On March 30th, 1806, she died at Devonshire House, surrounded by her family and by Bess. And here's the final twist, though. Somehow seems inevitable and outrageous at the same time. 3 years later, in 1809, the Duke of Devonshire married Bess. After all those years as his mistress, after all those years living in Georgiana's shadow, Bess finally became the Duchess of Devonshire herself. Now, you might think that's a happy ending for Bess. She got what she wanted, right? Security, title, position. But actually, her life as Duchess was miserable. The Duke's children, Georgiana's children, hated her. Society, which had tolerated her as a mistress, never fully accepted her as a duchess. She was always seen as the woman who destroyed Georgiana's happiness, even though the truth was far more complicated. When the Duke died in 1811, just 2 years after their marriage, Bess was essentially exiled from the family. She spent the rest of her life traveling abroad, never quite belonging anywhere, dying in 1824 in relative obscurity. So, what do we take from this story? What does it tell us about power and choice and survival in Georgiana's world? I think it tells us that the women we've been celebrating, these powerful political hostesses, these social queens, paid prices we can barely imagine. Yes, they had influence. Yes, they shaped politics and society. But their personal lives were often nightmares that they had to endure with grace, because showing pain would have been a weakness that enemies could exploit. Georgiana couldn't leave her marriage, couldn't publicly acknowledge her lover or claim her child, couldn't even express her anger at her husband's infidelity without risking her position. So she built a life around those constraints, found ways to survive, to maintain dignity, to keep going, and the fact that she did it with such style, such apparent cheerfulness, makes it more heartbreaking, not less, because we need to remember when we look at these glittering figures from history, when we admire their power and influence, we're often looking at women who were performing, who were maintaining façades that required enormous emotional labor, who were trapped in situations they couldn't escape and making the best of circumstances that would break most of us. The Managatta at Devonshire House wasn't an enlightened polyamorous relationship. It wasn't a feminist statement. It was a survival strategy, created by people with no good options. And it worked in the sense that everyone survived it. But at what cost? Georgiana died young, worn out by the effort of maintaining impossible balances. Bess got her title, but lost any chance of genuine happiness or acceptance. The Duke seems to have been fine, which tells you something about how these situations typically broke along gender lines. What strikes me most about this story is how it complicates everything we've talked about so far. Yes, these women were powerful. Yes, they shaped British politics and society, but they were also vulnerable, trapped, forced to make terrible choices that men never had to make. Their power was real but constrained, significant but costly, visible but built on invisible suffering. And Georgiana wasn't the only one paying these hidden prices. Every woman wielding power in Mayfair was making sacrifices, accepting compromises, living with contradictions that would have destroyed less determined people. Some, like Lady Melbourne, seemed to handle it better. But remember, we don't really know what it cost her internally. Others cracked under the pressure in ways that became public spectacles. And there was one woman in particular, Lady Melbourne's daughter-in-law, someone who'd grown up watching all of this, learning from it, and who decided she'd rather burn the whole system down than play by its rules. Her name was Caroline, and her story is where the careful edifice of Mayfair power starts showing its fractures. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in a world built on silence is to speak the truth out loud. Lady Caroline Lamb learned this lesson the hardest way possible. She grew up watching Georgiana hide her pain behind charm, watching her mother-in-law, Lady Melbourne, manipulate from shadows, watching the patronesses of Elmax wield their quiet power. And she looked at all of it and thought, "No, I will not play this game. I will not pretend. I will not be silent." It destroyed her. But my God, what a spectacular destruction it was. Caroline Ponson was born on November the 13th, 1785, into the absolute heart of Whig aristocracy. Her father was Frederick Ponnenby, 3rd Earl of Besper. Her mother was Henrietta, sister to Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. So Caroline grew up literally at Devonshire House, part of that glittering, chaotic household we just talked about. She was surrounded by her cousins, by political giants, by artists and poets, and the most celebrated people in Britain. But Caroline was different from birth, delicate both physically and emotionally. She was a tiny, fragile child who got sick easily and seemed to vibrate with nervous energy. Her parents worried about her constantly. They sent her to Italy for her health when she was young, and she nearly died there from an intestinal worm infection. It was so severe that everyone thought she wouldn't survive. But she did, and she came back to England with this quality that never left her. She seemed too sensitive for the world, too emotionally raw, unable to develop the protective shell that aristocratic life required. Her education was chaotic. She spent time at Devonshire House, where the children ran somewhat wild. Her Aunt Georgiana believed in Rousseau's educational theories: natural development, affection, minimal constraint, which sounds lovely, but in practice meant Caroline grew up without much discipline or structure. She was brilliant, creative, could read and write beautifully, spoke multiple languages, but she never learned self-control, never learned to hide what she was feeling, never learned that survival in her world required performance. And when she was 19, in June of 1805, she married William Lamb, Lady Melbourne's second son, the one she'd marked for greatness from childhood, the one who would become Prime Minister. Now here's what's interesting. William actually loved Caroline. Unlike most arranged marriages, this one started with genuine affection. They'd met at Brocket Hall years earlier when Caroline was just 13, and they'd been drawn to each other immediately. William found Caroline fascinating. She was unlike any other woman he knew, spontaneous and honest and alive in a way that felt refreshing after a childhood with his calculating mother. But William's family was horrified. Lady Melbourne in particular saw disaster coming. She knew Caroline's mother, Henrietta, and had always disliked her, thought she was overly dramatic, too emotional, lacking proper control. And Caroline seemed to be cut from the same cloth, only more so. Lady Melbourne could see that Caroline would never master the art of aristocratic discretion, would never understand when to be silent, when to compromise, when to hide. But William insisted, and eventually Lady Melbourne gave her approval because strategically it made sense. Caroline was connected to the most powerful Whig families in Britain through both parents. The marriage would strengthen William's position in the party. So Lady Melbourne said yes, while privately dreading what would come. The marriage started well. William and Caroline were genuinely happy for the first few years, but there were warning signs. Caroline gave birth to a stillborn child in January 1806, just months after her wedding. The grief nearly broke her. Then, in August 1807, she had a son, George Augustus, Frederick. But the boy had severe developmental problems, what we'd now recognize as significant intellectual disabilities. In that era, aristocratic families typically sent such children to institutions. But William and Caroline kept him at home, cared for him themselves, which shows you something about their characters. They loved their son despite everything. But it was also another source of private pain that Caroline had to carry, and Caroline couldn't carry things quietly. She wore her emotions on her face, in her voice, in everything she did. When she was happy, everyone knew. When she was sad, everyone knew. And as William became more focused on his political career, as he spent longer hours away from home pursuing the ambitions his mother had instilled in him, Caroline became lonely and restless and desperately needed attention. Enter Lord Byron. It's March 1812. Byron has just published the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and overnight he's become the most famous poet in England. He's 24 years old, darkly handsome, brooding, scandalous. He limps from a clubfoot, which somehow makes him more romantic, more tragic. Every woman in London wants to meet him, and Caroline Ponson, now Lady Caroline Lamb, meets him at a party at Holland House. According to legend, someone pointed Byron out to her and she responded, "That pale, interesting face, if he is as ugly as you say, I will not look at him." But she did look, and within weeks they were completely, catastrophically in love. Now, I need to be clear about something. This wasn't just Caroline being impulsive. Byron fell for her too hard. He'd had affairs before. He was notorious for them. But Caroline was different. She matched his intensity, his darkness, his refusal to conform. She wrote him poetry. She showed up at his door, dressed as a page boy so she could visit him without being recognized. She sent him notes written in her own blood. Yes, actually in blood. She cut herself and wrote to him with it. Does that sound unhinged? It absolutely was, but it was also the kind of grand romantic gesture that Byron understood. He'd grown up, swimming in emotional excess himself. For a while they fed each other's intensity, and it felt like the greatest love either of them had experienced. But here's where Caroline made her fatal mistake. She couldn't hide it, didn't even try to hide it, while other aristocratic women conducted affairs with discretion, meeting in private, maintaining plausible deniability, never acknowledging anything publicly. Caroline flaunted her relationship with Byron. She appeared with him at parties. She talked about him constantly. She made her passion visible to everyone, and London society was scandalized. Not because she was having an affair. Remember, that was common enough, but because she was being obvious about it. She was breaking the fundamental rule. Appearances must be maintained. You could do almost anything, as long as you pretended you weren't. Lady Melbourne watched this disaster unfold with horror. This was exactly what she'd feared. Caroline was threatening William's political career, embarrassing the family name, and making herself the subject of gossip throughout London. So Lady Melbourne did what she did best. She manipulated. She reached out to Byron, became his confidant, listened sympathetically as he complained about Caroline's intensity, her jealousy, her demands, and gradually, carefully, she convinced Byron that Caroline was becoming a problem. He needed to solve that her public displays were dangerous. For him, too, that he needed to end the affair. And Byron, who had his own reasons for wanting out. Caroline's intensity was exhausting even for him, agreed. In August 1812, just 5 months after the affair started, he broke it off. Sent Caroline a letter essentially saying it was over. He was done. She needed to leave him alone. Caroline's reaction was volcanic. She didn't accept it quietly, didn't retreat with dignity. Instead, she pursued Byron obsessively. She sent him letters begging him to reconsider. She showed up at places she knew he'd be. She threatened suicide. She actually attempted it once in a scene witnessed by multiple people at a party. When Byron appeared with his new lover, Caroline grabbed a knife and cut herself, dramatically in front of everyone. Can you imagine? The scandal was enormous. The stories spread through London like wildfire. Lady Caroline Lamb, the Earl's daughter, acting like a mad woman over a poet who'd publicly rejected her. It was the entertainment of the season, and it was destroying her. But Caroline didn't stop, because here's the thing about Caroline. She was incapable of protecting herself. She had no emotional armor, no ability to step back and calculate consequences. She just felt things and acted on them. And damn the consequences. William Lamb, to his enormous credit, stood by her. His mother raged at him, told him to divorce Caroline, to save his career by cutting her loose. But William refused. He'd married Caroline knowing what she was. He loved her even when loving her was difficult, even when it was professionally damaging. He wasn't going to abandon her just because she'd made his life complicated. But the affair with Byron wasn't over. Not really, because in 1816 Caroline did something that no one expected. She published a novel. It was called Glen Arvin, and it was a thinly veiled, absolutely devastating portrait of Byron and the society that had judged her. The main character, Glen, was clearly Byron, depicted as seductive, ultimately destructive. Other characters were recognizable as real people from London society, and Caroline herself appeared as the romantic heroine destroyed by Glenarvan's callousness. She put everything in that book, her pain, her anger, her sense of betrayal. She exposed the hypocrisy of aristocratic society, the cruelty of their judgments, the way women were discarded when they became inconvenient. It was brilliant. It was also social suicide. The book became an immediate bestseller. Everyone read it. Everyone recognized the characters, and everyone was appalled that Caroline had broken the code so completely. You didn't write about real people. You didn't expose society's secrets. You didn't make private dramas public entertainment. Byron himself was furious. He called it a published novel. His words, not mine, recorded in his letters. Other people described as characters in the book were equally outraged, and Caroline was effectively exiled from society. Almack's barred her. Lady Jersey personally saw to it. Former friends cut her off. Invitations stopped coming. Lady Melbourne had won in a way. She'd wanted Caroline destroyed, and now Caroline had destroyed herself. But it was a hollow victory because William remained loyal to his wife, and watching his career suffer because of Caroline's behavior, watching him stand by her even as she made his life impossible, that must have driven Lady Melbourne absolutely mad. Caroline spent the next 12 years in a kind of social exile. She and William stayed married, but the relationship was strained. They lived separately much of the time. Caroline wrote more novels. Graham Hamilton, Ada Ree, Penn Ruddock, all published in the early 1820s. They were less successful than Glenarvan, but they showed that Caroline had genuine literary talent. She could have been a significant writer if she'd been born in a different time with different constraints. But the emotional toll was catastrophic. Caroline became increasingly unstable. She drank heavily. She had mood swings that terrified the people around her. She'd be charming one moment and raging the next. What we'd now probably diagnose as bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder was just seen as madness, weakness, failure of character. In 1825, William finally agreed to a legal separation, not a divorce. That was still nearly impossible, but a separation that allowed them to live completely apart. Caroline moved to the country away from London and all its memories and judgments. She died 3 years later in January 1828. She was only 42 years old, but she'd lived a lifetime of intensity in those years. Her health had been destroyed by stress and drinking, and the sheer emotional exhaustion of being Caroline Lamb in a world that couldn't handle who she was. Here's what haunts me about Caroline's story. She was right about everything. Society was hypocritical. The rules were designed to protect men and punish women. The game was rigged, and playing it required sacrificing your authentic self. Caroline saw all of that clearly and refused to participate. She chose honesty over survival, authenticity over acceptance, truth over power, and it killed her. But does that make her wrong, or does it make the system wrong? Because yes, Georgiana and Lady Melbourne survived by playing the game skillfully. They had long lives, achieved their goals, maintained their positions, but at what internal cost? Georgiana died young, too, worn down by the effort of maintaining impossible balances. And Lady Melbourne, did she ever have a moment of genuine connection with another human being? Did she ever let her guard down, stop calculating, just be? Caroline couldn't have survived their way. Her personality wouldn't allow it, but they couldn't have survived our way either. The tragedy is that there was no good option. The system itself was the problem, and individual women had to choose how they'd navigate its cruelties. Some chose silence and strategy. Caroline chose volume and truth. Both paths led to suffering. What's interesting is how history has treated these different choices. Georgiana is remembered fondly as a tragic beauty and political influencer. Lady Melbourne is remembered as formidable and clever. But Caroline is usually remembered as crazy, as a cautionary tale, as the woman who loved too much and destroyed herself. But I think that's wrong. I think Caroline was brave in a way the others couldn't be. She refused to pretend, refused to perform, refused to accept that who she was needed to be hidden or managed or controlled. Yes, it destroyed her. But she stayed herself until the end. And there's something powerful in that, even if it's also heartbreaking. You know what Byron said about her years later, after both their careers were over and they'd lived through all the consequences? He said Caroline was too sincere. Think about that. Too sincere. As if sincerity is a flaw, as if honesty is a weakness, and in their world it was absolute sincerity would get you destroyed every single time. So what do we do with that? What do we learn from watching these women navigate impossible choices? I don't have an easy answer, but I think we need to hold both truths at once. The strategic silence of Georgiana and Lady Melbourne allowed them to accumulate real power and make real changes. But Caroline's refusal to be silenced was also valuable, also necessary, also a form of resistance that mattered. Maybe what we're seeing here isn't a story about right and wrong strategies. Maybe it's a story about how oppressive systems force impossible choices, how you can play the game and lose yourself or refuse to play and lose everything else. How women, in particular, are forced to choose between authenticity and survival in ways men never have to consider. And here's the sobering part. We're still making versions of these choices. Now, the specifics have changed, but the fundamental dynamic, be quiet and strategic or be loud and pay the price, that's still operating. Women in every field have to calculate when to speak up, and when to stay silent, when to push back and when to let things go, how much of themselves to reveal and how much to hide. The consequences are less severe than they were in Caroline's time, but the calculation itself is still familiar. All of these women, Georgiana, Lady Melbourne, Caroline, were trapped in a system that demanded they trade parts of themselves for basic security and acceptance. The fact that they found different ways to navigate that trade doesn't make some right and others wrong. It makes them human, complicated, contradictory, doing their best with terrible options. But we're not done exploring those options yet, because there's one aspect of these women's lives we haven't fully examined, the foundation everything else rested on. We've talked about their power, their strategies, their personal struggles, but we haven't talked about how they got there in the first place, how they entered this world of wealth and influence. And that story, the story of aristocratic marriage, is where we see the machinery of their world most nakedly, where we see young girls traded like commodities, where love was never supposed to enter the equation, and where the consequences of those transactions shaped everything that came after. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're 12 years old. You're playing with dolls, learning to read, thinking about absolutely nothing more serious than what you'll have for dinner. And then your father walks into the room and tells you that next week you're getting married to a man you've never met. A man who's 21 years old and there's nothing you can say about it. No choice, no negotiation, no escape. You're a financial transaction that's about to be completed, and your childhood just ended in the time it took your father to make that announcement. This actually happened not in some distant medieval past, but in 1677 in London. The girl's name was Mary Davies. She was 12. The man was Thomas Grosvenor, age 21. And that marriage, that transaction created Mayfair. Every house we've been talking about every ball, every salon, every bit of power these women wielded. It all rested on that one 12-year-old girl who had no say in her own future. Welcome to the machinery of aristocratic marriage, where love was a fairy tale, women were currency, and the most important decision of your life was made by everyone except you. Let's talk about how this system actually worked, because it shaped everything. Every marriage we've discussed, Georgiana to the Duke, Lady Melbourne to Peniston Lamb, Caroline to William, they all followed the same basic pattern, a pattern so rigid, so universally understood that no one even questioned it. And that pattern began with a fundamental principle. Marriage is a merger, not a romance. Think about it like a business deal, because that's exactly how aristocratic families thought about it. You have assets. They have assets. By combining those assets through marriage, both families benefit. Your assets might be land or money or political connections or an ancient title. Their assets might be similar or complementary. The goal is to make both families wealthier, more powerful, better positioned for the future. And the bride and groom, they're not the parties to the transaction. They're the mechanism by which it happens. They're the contract made flesh. Their personal feelings about each other are as relevant as the feelings of the deed to a property or the certificate for a stock share, which is to say completely irrelevant. Now, this system had existed for centuries across Europe, but it reached a particular intensity among the British aristocracy in the 18th and 19th centuries, for reasons that tell us a lot about how that society worked. See, unlike some European countries where titles and property could pass through female lines more easily, British law was very clear. Everything went to sons. Daughters inherited only if there were no male heirs at all. This system, primogeniture, meant that eldest sons got everything, and everyone else got whatever the eldest son felt like giving them. This created a desperate scramble. If you were an eldest son, you needed to marry someone who'd bring additional wealth or connections to supplement what you'd inherit. If you were a younger son, you needed to marry money because you weren't inheriting the estate. If you were a daughter, you needed to marry, well, because you'd have no independent income otherwise. Everyone was trapped in this system where marriage was your only path to security. Let me give you some examples that show just how cold-blooded this could be. In 1719, the Duke of Richmond found himself unable to pay his debts, massive debts, the kind that would destroy his family's position and send him to debtor's prison. So he made a deal with the Earl of Cadogan, who was wealthy but not as prestigious. The Duke agreed to have his 18-year-old heir marry the Earl's 13-year-old daughter, 13. The wedding happened almost immediately. And then, this is the part that always gets me, they sent the girl back to the nursery. She literally returned to playing with toys. She didn't see her husband again until she was 16, and they decided she was old enough to actually be a wife. 3 years. She was married but still a child, just sitting there, waiting to grow up enough to fulfill the contract her family had made with her body. Or consider Georgiana's mother's desperate plea before Georgiana's wedding. She wrote, "I had flattered myself I should have had more time to have improved her understanding and with God's assistance to have strengthened her principles and enabled her to avoid the many snares that vice and folly will throw in her way." Read that again. Her mother knew that Georgiana wasn't ready, knew that 17 was too young, knew that this marriage would expose Georgiana to danger she couldn't handle. But what could she do? The match was too good to refuse. The Duke of Devonshire was one of the richest men in England. The Spencers were ambitious, and Georgiana's feelings, her readiness, her maturity, her needs, those didn't factor into the decision at all. Here's what kills me about these arrangements. The parents often did love their daughters. Georgiana's parents genuinely cared about her. But they loved their family's position more. They loved advancement more. They loved the idea of their daughter being a duchess more than they loved the actual girl who'd have to live that life, and the girls themselves were raised to accept this. From earliest childhood, aristocratic daughters were taught that their purpose was to marry well. They learned accomplishments, dancing, music, drawing, languages, not for personal enrichment, but to make them more marketable. They learned to manage households, not because they'd have freedom to run things their way, but because they'd need to supervise servants in whatever house their husband owned. They learned to be charming and pleasant and agreeable, because those qualities would help them attract the best possible match. It was grooming. That's the word we'd use now. They were being groomed from birth to accept a system that would treat them as property. The actual mechanics of matchmaking were fascinating and horrifying. During the London season, from roughly February through June, aristocratic families would bring their daughters to town. These girls, usually between 17 and 21, would be presented at court, meaning they'd be officially introduced to the king and queen. This marked them as ready for marriage. They'd then attend an endless round of balls, dinners, and gatherings designed specifically for young people to meet potential spouses. But meet is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because you weren't really getting to know each other. You'd dance together maybe twice if the chaperones were feeling permissive. You'd make polite conversation in drawing rooms, always supervised. You'd see each other at events. And based on these carefully controlled interactions and on information your families exchanged about wealth and property and connections, a decision would be made about whether you were suited to marry. The whole process took weeks, sometimes months, but the actual time you spent truly alone with your future husband, having real conversations about real things, usually measured in minutes, if it happened at all. Georgiana met the Duke of Devonshire in Spa when she was 15. They married when she was 17, and in between they probably spent less than 20 hours in actual conversation with each other. How could she possibly have known what kind of man he was, how cold, how emotionally unavailable, how fundamentally unsuited to make her happy? She couldn't. She just had to hope, and hope was usually disappointed, because here's the cruel mathematics of the situation. Men were choosing based on beauty, dowry, and family connections. Women weren't choosing at all. They were accepting or rejecting offers made to their fathers, and compatibility, personality, emotional connection. Those factors didn't appear anywhere in the equation. Let me tell you about the dowries, because they are important for understanding the economics. A dowry was money or property that the bride's family gave to the groom's family as part of the marriage agreement. It was supposed to provide for the wife's support, and if she was widowed, her future income. But in practice it became the husband's to manage, and many men spent it immediately on debts or improvements to their estates. A good dowry for an upper-ass marriage in the late 1700s was somewhere between £10,000 and £30,000. To put that in perspective, a working-class family might live on £30 a year, so we're talking about generational wealth changing hands. Lady Melbourne brought £10,000 to her marriage, a respectable sum that helped secure her position despite not being from the absolute top tier of aristocracy. But some dowries were enormous. The really wealthy families might offer £50,000 or more. And here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes the bride's family would pay a large dowry specifically because the groom's family had a prestigious title. Essentially, they were buying their daughter a better social position. The groom's family was selling access to their name and status. Everyone knew what was happening, and everyone pretended it was about anything other than a straight-up purchase. This reached its peak later in the 1880s and 1890s with the dollar princesses, American heiresses who married impoverished British aristocrats. Their families would pay absolutely staggering sums, hundreds of thousands of pounds, to buy their daughters' titles, and the British aristocrats whose estates were failing and who needed cash desperately would marry women they barely knew and often didn't like in exchange for that money. But that's getting ahead of our story. The point is, the system was always transactional. The dollar princesses just made it more obvious. Now what happened after the wedding? Well, that depended entirely on the husband, because legally the wife ceased to exist as an independent person. There's a legal term for this: cover. It meant that a married woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband's. She couldn't own property. Everything she had became his. She couldn't sign contracts. She couldn't sue or be sued. She couldn't control her own money. If she worked and earned wages, those belonged to her husband. If she inherited money, it went to him. She had no legal existence separate from him. Her children legally his. If the marriage ended, he had absolute custody. We saw this with Bess Foster, whose husband took her sons away, and she had no legal recourse whatsoever. A mother had no rights to her own children, none. She couldn't divorce him except in the most extreme circumstances, and even then it required an act of Parliament. Literally a special law passed just to dissolve that one marriage. It cost thousands of pounds and required proving adultery combined with something else: cruelty, incest, desertion. Adultery alone wasn't enough, not for a woman seeking divorce. Though, interestingly, a man could divorce his wife for adultery alone. The double standard was written directly into the law, so once you married, you were trapped. If your husband was kind, you might be happy. If he was indifferent, you'd be lonely. If he was cruel, you'd suffer, and there was nothing you could do about it except endure. Do you see now why these women fought so hard for social power? Why Georgiana threw herself into politics? Why Lady Melbourne built her network of influence? Why the patronesses of Almack's wielded their authority with such intensity? The social power was the only power available to them. They couldn't control their own money, their own children, their own bodies, but they could control who got invited to parties, who got introduced to whom, whose reputation thrived, and whose was destroyed. It was the tiniest sliver of autonomy in lives that offered almost none. And it was built on the foundation of marriages that had nothing to do with love, compatibility, or personal choice. Every woman wielding power in Mayfair had started her adult life being traded like property in a transaction she didn't control. The fact that some of them managed to carve out influence despite that is remarkable, but it doesn't make the system less horrifying. Let me give you one more example that shows just how normalized this was. Caroline Lamb's mother, Harriet, married her husband when she was very young. It was an arranged match between prominent families. Her husband proceeded to have multiple affairs, including a very public long-term relationship with another woman. Harriet was expected to ignore it, to maintain her dignity, to raise her children, and to never complain. And she did, mostly. She played her role, but the emotional cost was enormous. She suffered from what we'd now call depression, had episodes of illness that were probably psychosomatic, and raised her daughter Caroline in an atmosphere of barely suppressed emotional chaos. Is it any wonder Caroline turned out unable to hide her feelings, unable to play the game, unable to pretend everything was fine? She'd watched her mother sacrifice her authentic self for years, and some part of Caroline must have decided she'd rather be destroyed than do the same. Here's the most devastating part of this system. It was self-perpetuating. These women who'd been traded in marriage themselves then did the same thing to their daughters. Georgiana's mother arranged her marriage. Lady Melbourne arranged Emily's marriage. They'd lived through it. They knew how painful it could be, and they did it anyway because they couldn't imagine an alternative. The system was so total, so complete, that even its victims became its enforcers. There were exceptions, rare moments, when love did enter the equation. William Lamb genuinely loved Caroline and fought to marry her despite his mother's objections. That's unusual. Even more unusual, marriages where affection developed after the wedding. Some couples did grow to care for each other, but it was never the expectation, never the goal. If it happened, wonderful. If it didn't, well, that's what mistresses and separate lives were for. And that brings us to the mistress system which we need to understand because it was another crucial part of this machinery. Aristocratic men were expected to be faithful before marriage officially anyway, but absolutely no one expected fidelity after. Having a mistress was normal, sometimes even a status symbol. The more prestigious your mistress, the more it reflected on you. Women, meanwhile, were supposed to be absolutely faithful. Their sexuality belonged to their husbands. The children they produced needed to be unquestionably legitimate. A wife's affair was catastrophic, not because of emotional betrayal, but because it threatened the inheritance line. Who would inherit the title, the property, the fortune? Only legitimate sons born to the legal wife. An affair risked introducing illegitimate children into that line, and that was unforgivable. This is why Lady Melbourne could have affairs with half of Whig leadership and respectable. Because she was discreet, and because her husband officially acknowledged all the children as his, even though everyone suspected otherwise. The appearance of legitimacy was maintained, so the system continued working. This is also why Georgiana's affair with Charles Grey was such a disaster. She got pregnant, and the timing made it impossible to claim the child was the Duke's. The pregnancy threatened to expose the affair publicly, which would have humiliated the Duke and destroyed Georgiana, so the child had to be hidden, given away, erased from the official family tree. Can you imagine carrying a baby for 9 months, going through labor, holding your child for just a few days, and then watching them be taken away forever, knowing you'll never be their mother in any real sense, that you'll see them occasionally as they grow up, but always at a distance, always pretending you're just a family friend? The emotional violence of that is almost incomprehensible. But it was the price of maintaining the system. The inheritance line had to be clear. The appearance of propriety had to be preserved. Individual suffering was irrelevant compared to those imperatives. Now I want to step back and ask why. Why did this system exist? Why was it maintained so ruthlessly? And the answer is about property and power. The British aristocracy controlled enormous wealth, land primarily, which generated income through tenant farming. They also held political power disproportionate to their numbers. A few thousand families controlled Parliament, held all the important government positions, set the rules for everyone else. They maintained this power through careful control of marriage, by only marrying within their class, by consolidating wealth through strategic matches, by treating daughters as assets to be deployed rather than people with independent worth. They kept the pow, and money circulating within a closed system. It was a cartel, essentially, and like any cartel, it benefited those inside enormously while exploiting everyone outside. The women trapped in this system had 3 basic options. They could submit, completely accepting loveless marriages and sacrificing any claim to personal happiness. They could play the game, strategically using what limited power they had. Social influence, sexual appeal, strategic friendships to carve out some space for themselves. Or they could rebel, refuse to play, and face the consequences of social destruction. We've seen all 3 approaches. Some women we haven't even named chose submission and disappeared into quiet desperation. Georgiana and Lady Melbourne chose strategic navigation with varying degrees of success and suffering. Caroline chose rebellion and was destroyed for it. But here's what I want you to understand. None of these choices were good. None of these women were free. None of them had the option to simply live as full human beings with autonomy over their own lives. The system itself was the problem, and individual solutions could only mitigate the damage, never eliminate it. And yet, and this is crucial, these women still mattered, still made impacts that echoed through generations, still found ways to shape history despite operating within crushing constraints. That's not because the system was okay. It's because human beings are remarkably resilient and creative when it comes to survival. Given even the smallest opening, even the tiniest crack in the wall, people will find ways to assert their humanity, to make their voices heard, to matter. The women of Mayfair found those cracks and what they did with them, the power they accumulated, the influence they wielded, the ways they shaped politics and culture and society, that's going to occupy the rest of our story, because we're about to look at the darker side of their survival, strategies, the addictions, the debts, the secret pregnancies, the slow unraveling of women trying to hold together lives that were fundamentally untenable. And once we see that darkness clearly, once we understand the full price they paid, then we can start to assess what their legacy really means. There's a small brown bottle that sits in museums now, innocuous looking, the kind of thing you'd walk past without a second glance. It's labeled laudanum, and it held a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, sweet-tasting, easy to take, sold openly in every pharmacy in Georgian England. And it destroyed more aristocratic women than any scandal, any affair, any social disgrace ever could. Because when your life is unbearable and you can't escape, you find ways to make it bearable. And sometimes those ways kill you slowly while everyone politely looks away. Welcome to the dark side of silk, where gambling debts reached into the millions, where opium addiction was called taking medicine, where secret pregnancies had to be hidden at any cost, and where the pressure of maintaining that perfect facade drove women to destroy themselves in ways their society refused to acknowledge. Let's start with Georgiana's debts, because they're almost incomprehensible. We're talking about £64,000 by the late 1790s. In today's money, that's somewhere between £3 and £4 million. How does someone even accumulate that kind of debt? What was she spending it on? The answer is cards, faro specifically. It was the most popular gambling game among the aristocracy, and it was brutally fast. You could lose thousands of pounds in a single evening, and Georgiana played almost every night. But here's what's important to understand. The gambling wasn't really about money, it was about escape, sitting at a faro table, focused completely on the cards, on dealer's hands, on the next bet. That was the only time Georgiana's mind wasn't spinning with everything else. Her loveless marriage, her failure to produce a male heir for years, the Duke's coldness, Bess living in her house, sleeping with her husband, the constant pressure to be charming, to be perfect, to keep everyone happy while her own heart was breaking. At the faro table, none of that mattered. There was only the game, the rush of winning, the temporary oblivion of losing. It was addiction, absolutely, but it was also the only coping mechanism available to her. And she wasn't alone. Gambling addiction was epidemic among aristocratic women. Lady Besper, Caroline Lamb's mother, Georgiana's sister, also had massive gambling debts. So did dozens of other women in their circle. They'd gather for card parties that would last until dawn, betting sums that could buy estates, and they do it night after night after night. Why didn't anyone stop them? Well, partly because gambling was considered a normal aristocratic activity. Men gambled too sometimes, losing entire estates in a single evening. It was seen as part of the lifestyle, a display of wealth and nerve, but also, I think, because on some level everyone understood that these women needed escape. The lives they were living were so constrained, so performative, so emotionally exhausting that gambling provided a release valve. Better they lose money at cards than have complete nervous breakdowns. Except the debts created their own nightmare. Because women couldn't legally own property or control money, Georgiana's debts were technically the Duke's responsibility, but she was terrified to tell him the full extent of what she owed. So she'd borrow from friends, promising to pay them back, then borrow from other friends to pay the first friends, then borrow from moneylenders at terrible interest rates. The debt spiraled, compounding, growing like a cancer. And the moneylenders weren't polite about it. They'd send collectors to Devon your house. They'd threaten to expose her publicly, to create a scandal that would destroy her reputation. Georgiana spent years in a state of constant anxiety, juggling debts, hiding letters, lying to the Duke about where money was going. The stress was overwhelming. Eventually, in 1793, the Duke found out. The full extent of the debts came to light, and he was furious. Not just about the money, though that was considerable, but about the deception, the years of lying. This was one of the reasons he forced Georgiana into exile when she got pregnant with Grey's child. It was punishment partly, a way of asserting control over a wife who'd spun out of his control in multiple ways. But even after that crisis, Georgiana kept gambling. Because addiction doesn't respond to logic or consequences. It's not about the money. It's about the need to escape, to feel something other than the constant pressure of performance. And Georgiana never found another way to cope. Now, let's talk about laudanum, because this is where things get really dark. Laudanum was opium, actual opium, dissolved in alcohol, usually wine or brandy. It was sold openly. No prescription needed. Every pharmacy carried it. Doctors prescribed it for everything: headaches, coughs, menstrual cramps, insomnia, nervousness, melancholy. It was considered completely normal, a harmless medicine, except it was incredibly addictive, and it was killing people slowly, quietly, in ways that weren't understood at the time. Georgiana took laudanum regularly from at least the 1790s onward. So did many women in her circle. They'd take a few drops in water or wine for headaches, a bit more for sleep, a bit more when anxiety made it impossible to function, and gradually, without realizing what was happening, they'd become dependent. Their bodies would need it. Stopping would cause withdrawal symptoms, shaking, sweating, terrible anxiety. Seemed like illness returning. So they take more laudanum to treat it, never understanding that the illness was actually withdrawal from the drug itself. How many aristocratic women were opium addicts without knowing it? We'll never know for certain, but contemporary accounts mention women taking laudanum constantly, dosing themselves multiple times a day, unable to function without it, and everyone just accepted it as normal, taking medicine, being delicate, managing their health. The effects were devastating. Opium makes you drowsy, confused, unable to concentrate. It causes constipation. Severe. It can be life-threatening. It suppresses appetite, leading to dramatic weight loss. It causes mood swings, emotional instability, paranoia, and None of this was connected to the laudanum at the time. Women suffering these symptoms were just called nervous, hysterical, weak. They were blamed for their own suffering, while the actual cause sat in a brown bottle on their dressing table. Georgiana was drinking heavily too. By the way, wine primarily consumed in quantities that would alarm us today, but that were considered relatively normal for the time. Aristocrats drank a lot. Beer or aliber with breakfast, wine with lunch and dinner, port or brandy in the evening. But Georgiana was drinking more than social norms dictated, using alcohol, the same way she used laudanum and gambling as escape as medication, as temporary relief from unbearable pressure. Put it all together: the opium addiction, the alcohol dependence, the gambling compulsion, the stress of maintaining her public role, the emotional trauma of her personal life. And you have someone who's barely holding on, who's destroying her health systematically while everyone around her either doesn't notice or doesn't care enough to intervene. And this brings us to secret pregnancies, because we need to understand just how dangerous and traumatic these situations were. Georgiana's pregnancy with Grey's child, which we discussed earlier, required months of exile, a dangerous journey during wartime, and ultimately giving up her baby. But she wasn't alone in facing this kind of crisis. Secret pregnancies happened regularly among aristocratic women. Sometimes from affairs like Georgian's, sometimes from rape, which was more common than historical records suggest. A woman had no legal recourse if her husband forced himself on her, obviously, but she also had limited recourse if another man did, particularly if he was of higher social status. The scandal of admitting to rape was often considered worse than the rape itself. So women stayed silent. When a woman became pregnant outside marriage, or pregnant in a way that couldn't be explained as her husband's child, she had very few options. There was no legal abortion. It was criminal and extremely dangerous. There were folk remedies, herbs, and potions that were supposed to induce miscarriage, but they were unreliable and often poisonous. Women died from taking them, either from the poison itself or from the hemorrhaging they caused. So, usually, the only option was to carry the pregnancy to term in secret. This meant leaving London, going to the countryside or abroad, giving birth with only a trusted companion present, and then giving the baby away, usually to the father's family, if he was willing to acknowledge paternity privately, sometimes to orphanages or to poor families paid to take the child. The physical danger was enormous. Childbirth in the late 1700s was life-threatening under the best circumstances. 1 in 5 women died in childbirth at some point in their lives. And secret births were worse because you couldn't call the best doctors, couldn't have multiple attendants, couldn't risk anyone finding out. Women gave birth in rented rooms attended by midwives who were paid to keep silent, with no real medical support if something went wrong. And the emotional trauma carrying a baby for 9 months, going through labor and then immediately giving up your child, never being able to acknowledge them, never being able to be their mother. That's a grief that never heals. Georgiana wrote letters about Eliza, her secret daughter, that showed just how much losing her hurt. Years later she'd see Eliza occasionally, always at a distance, always as a family acquaintance, and she had to smile and be pleasant and never ever show how much she wanted to hold her daughter. How many other women went through versions of this we don't know. These pregnancies were hidden, the births were secret, the adoptions were disguised. But given what we know about aristocratic life, the loveless marriages, the affairs that happened as escape or revenge, the lack of reliable contraception, it must have been common, and each one was a private tragedy that the woman involved had to carry alone. Let me tell you about another form of suffering that's harder to quantify but just as real, the simple grinding loneliness of these women's lives, surrounded by people constantly, servants, family, friends, acquaintances, but genuinely known by almost no one. Because showing your real self, your real feelings, your real struggles, that was weakness. That was vulnerability. That could be used against you. So you performed every day. You put on the costume, painted on the smile, and played your role. You were charming at parties even when you wanted to scream. You laughed at jokes even when you wanted to cry. You maintained perfect composure even when your world was falling apart. And you did it alone because trusting anyone completely was too dangerous. Georgiana had friends. Yes, she was beloved. Yes. But who did she truly trust? Bess, maybe. And look how that turned out. Bess was sleeping with her husband, Lady Melbourne, too calculating to ever let her guard down completely. Her own mother disappointed in Georgiana's failures, always pushing her to do better, be better. Even in her letters, even in her diary, Georgiana was performing, writing for potential future readers, maintaining an image, even in supposedly private documents. That level of isolation, of having to perform constantly without any safe space to just be yourself, it's a form of psychological torture. And it was the default state for aristocratic women. No wonder so many of them turned to gambling, laudanum, and alcohol. No wonder they developed what we'd now call depression, anxiety disorders, and addiction. The circumstances they were living in would drive anyone to desperate coping mechanisms. And here's the cruelest part. When they showed signs of suffering, when the cracks in their facade started to show, they were blamed for it. They were called hysterical, over-emotional, weak, morally deficient. The very society that created these impossible conditions judged women harshly for failing to meet them perfectly. Caroline Lamb's mental health deteriorated dramatically in her later years. She had mood swings, paranoia, episodes where she'd act erratically or violently. Instead of recognizing this as mental illness requiring compassion and treatment, people called her mad, used her condition to dismiss everything about her, and turned her into a cautionary tale about what happens when women don't control themselves. But what was she supposed to control herself with? She had no medication that worked. Lord made things worse, not better. She had no therapy, no understanding of mental health, no framework for recognizing that she was sick rather than bad. She had only judgment, contempt, and social exile, and those don't heal anyone. Think about living in that world. You're suffering from what we'd now recognize as depression or anxiety or PTSD from trauma. But the only medical understanding available says you're either physically ill or morally weak. The only treatments are bloodletting or being confined to your room or being sent away to rest in the country where you're essentially imprisoned. There's no one who understands what you're going through, no language to even describe it accurately, just suffering and blame and more suffering. Is it any wonder these women turned to anything that offered relief? Gambling gave them escape and excitement. Lordom gave them numbness and temporary peace. Alcohol gave them courage and oblivion. Affairs gave them proof that they were desirable, that someone wanted them. These weren't moral failings, these were desperate attempts to survive circumstances that were fundamentally survivable only at great cost, and the cost showed in their bodies. Georgiana died at 48, but she looked far older. Years of stress, addiction, poor health, and emotional trauma had aged her dramatically. The woman who'd been celebrated as a great beauty died nearly blind, prematurely grey, worn down to nothing. Lady Melbourne lived longer. She was 67 when she died, but her final months were agonizing. She had rheumatism so severe she could barely move, and she died, slowly, in terrible pain, while her children watched helplessly. These weren't peaceful deaths after long, fulfilling lives. These were bodies giving out under strain they were never meant to bear. Physical manifestations of psychological and emotional stress that had nowhere else to go. Now, I don't want you to think this was universal. Some aristocratic women navigated this world more successfully, fared less dramatically, found ways to create genuinely happy lives within the constraints, but they were the exceptions. The majority struggled, suffered quietly, and died younger than they should have, worn down by lives that demanded everything and gave back very little. And the system that created this suffering, it just kept going because the people benefiting from it, primarily men but also the families maintaining wealth and power through strategic marriages, had no incentive to change anything. The suffering of individual women was acceptable collateral damage in the larger project of preserving aristocratic power. This is what I mean when I say the power these women wielded came at an enormous cost. Yes, they shaped politics. Yes, they influenced society. Yes, they left their mark on history. But they paid for it with their health, their happiness, their sanity, and often their lives. And that trade-off wasn't one they chose freely. It was forced on them by a system that gave them no better options. So when we celebrate these women, and we should celebrate them because what they accomplished despite everything is remarkable, we also need to remember what it cost them. We need to see the laudanum bottles alongside the silk gowns, the gambling debts alongside the political victories, the secret pregnancies alongside the salon gatherings, the full picture, dark and light together, because that's the truth of their lives, and they deserve to have their truth told, not just the glamorous parts that make for good stories. They deserve to be seen as full human beings who suffered and struggled and survived, or didn't survive, circumstances that would have broken most of us. But there's another dimension to their world we haven't explored yet, one that complicates the picture even further, because these women weren't just victims of their circumstances. They were intellectuals, artists, scientists, and cultural innovators. They created salons that weren't just political gathering places, but genuine centers of intellectual exchange. They pursued knowledge in an era that told them women's minds were inferior. They wrote, they studied, they contributed to the Enlightenment, even though history rarely remembers them for it. And understanding that side of their lives, the ways they fed their minds and spirits even while their circumstances tried to crush them, that's what we're going to explore next. Walk into Chatsworth House today, into the geology room specifically, and you'll find display cases filled with minerals: amethyst geodes from Brazil, blue John fluorite from Derbyshire caves, specimens of quartz and calcite and malachite, each one carefully labeled and catalogued. This isn't a random collection assembled by Victorian hobbyists. This is Georgiana's collection. The Duchess of Devonshire, yes, the same woman we've been watching gamble away fortunes and struggle through impossible relationships, spent years building one of the finest mineral collections in England. She studied their properties, corresponded with geologists, commissioned custom display cases, and contributed genuine scientific knowledge to the field of minology. Surprised? Most people are, because we've gotten so used to seeing these women as either powerful hostesses or tragic victims that we forget they were also intellectuals, scholars, artists, scientists, women who fed their minds with the same intensity they brought to everything else, who pursued knowledge in an era that told them they were intellectually inferior to men, who created and studied and contributed to the Enlightenment despite having to do it in the margins of lives dedicated to other purposes. Let me tell you about Georgiana's mineral collection, because it's genuinely impressive. She started electing in the 1780s, initially as a fashionable hobby. Mineral collecting was trendy among the aristocracy. You'd display specimens in your home as status symbols, proof of wealth and taste, but Georgiana took it far beyond fashion. She became genuinely knowledgeable, studying the scientific properties of different minerals, learning to identify specimens by their crystal structure and chemical composition. She worked with a local mineralogist named White Watson, who helped her catalogue the collection systematically. They didn't just arrange pretty rocks on shelves, they organized them according to scientific principles, creating a resource that other scholars could use. Georgiana corresponded with geologists across Europe, exchanging specimens, sharing information about where different minerals could be found, discussing theories about how they formed. And she turned some of these minerals into art. She commissioned craftsmen to create vases, decorative objects, and jewelry from specimens in her collection. Blue John fluorite, that stunning purple-blue stone found only in Derbyshire, became a particular specialty. She helped popularize it, turning a local curiosity into a sought-after luxury material. But here's what strikes me most. Georgiana maintained this scientific pursuit through everything else we've discussed. Through the gambling, addiction, the unhappy marriage, the scandal of her affair, the trauma of giving up her child. Somehow she still made time to study minerals, to expand her collection, to contribute to scientific knowledge. It was an anchor for her, maybe a part of her life that had nothing to do with social performance or political maneuvering, just pure intellectual curiosity and the satisfaction of learning. She also had a chemistry laboratory at Devonshire House, an actual laboratory with equipment for conducting experiments. She studied IC chemistry, the chemistry of gases, which was at the cutting edge of science in the 1790s. She performed experiments on chemical reactions and color changes. No, she didn't publish scientific papers. No, her work isn't cited in the history of chemistry. But she was engaging with serious science at a level that most men of her time never attempted. Think about what that means. Women weren't allowed to attend universities. They couldn't join scientific societies. They couldn't present papers or have their work taken seriously by the official scientific establishment. But they could study privately, conduct experiments in their homes, build knowledge that satisfied their intellectual hunger, even if it never received public recognition. And Georgiana wasn't the only one. The salons we've talked about, those political gathering places, were also intellectual centers. The best salons mixed politics, art, literature, philosophy, and science. The conversation would flow from election, strategy to poetry to the latest discoveries in natural history, all in one evening. And the women hosting these salons weren't just facilitating these conversations. They were participating in them, contributing ideas, asking questions, pushing the discussions forward. Georgiana was friends with members of the Blue Stocking Society. Have you heard of them? It was an informal network of intellectual women, writers, scholars, artists who gathered regularly to discuss literature and ideas. The name came from an insult. Actually, a critic sneered that these women's gatherings were so unfeminine that the men who attended them wore blue worsted stockings instead of fashionable black silk. The women embraced the name, turned the insult into an identity, and created spaces where female intellectuals could connect and collaborate. The Blue Stockings included some remarkable women. Elizabeth Montague Butt wrote influential literary criticism and hosted legendary intellectual salons. Hannah More, who wrote plays and poetry and religious texts. Fanny Burney, whose novels were bestsellers and who documented Georgian life in her extensive diaries. These women were producing serious intellectual work, and they were taken seriously by many of the leading thinkers of their time. Georgiana moved in these circles. She knew these women. She participated in their conversations, and she wrote, "Oh yes, Georgiana was an author. She published a novel in 1779 called The Sylph. It was published anonymously, as most women's novels were, but everyone knew who'd written it. The novel was a social satire, skewering the superficiality of aristocratic life, while also telling a story about a young woman trying to navigate marriage and society." Sound familiar? She was writing about her own experiences, thinly disguised as fiction. The novel was successful. It went through multiple editions. People read it, discussed it, recognized the characters and situations. But because it was published anonymously and because women's literary work wasn't taken as seriously as men's, the Cell has been largely forgotten by literary history, which is a shame because it's actually quite good, witty, observant, moving in places. Georgiana also wrote poetry, lots of it. Some was published in magazines and newspapers under her name, which was unusual for aristocratic women. Most of it circulated privately, among friends. Her poetry covered everything from political topics to personal emotions to nature observations. Again, it's been largely forgotten, but it shows a woman with genuine literary talent trying to find expression in a world that didn't value female creativity. And it wasn't just Georgiana. Many aristocratic women wrote novels, poetry, essays, letters that were literary works in themselves. Lady Caroline L.'s novels were bestsellers in their time. Other women translated important works from French or Italian, making them available to English readers. Still others wrote memoirs that documented their era in invaluable detail. But most of this work has vanished from the literary canon. Why? Because it was by women. Because it dealt with domestic topics rather than grand political or philosophical themes. Because the women who wrote it couldn't access the institutions, universities, publishing houses, literary societies that would have preserved and promoted their work. So it got lost, dismissed as trivial, erased from the historical record. Let me tell you about one more aspect of this intellectual world: the political education these women provided to men. We've talked about how they hosted salons where political strategies were developed, but they also educated young politicians, teaching them how to think, how to argue, how to understand the world. Georgiana mentored numerous young Whig politicians. She'd discuss political philosophy with them, challenge their assumptions, help them develop their ideas. Charles James Fox valued her political insights enormously. The Prince of Wales sought her advice on everything from policy to personal matters. These weren't just social friendships, these were intellectual relationships where Georgiana's mind was respected and her input was taken seriously. Lady Melbourne did the same thing, though in her characteristic, calculating style. She'd identify promising young men and cultivate them, not just as political allies, but as proteges. She'd teach them how Parliament really worked, how to build coalitions, how to navigate the complex social machinery that underlay political power. Several politicians credited her with their success, acknowledging that she taught them things no one else would have. And here's what's fascinating. These women often knew more about practical politics than many of the men in Parliament. Because they were at the center of the social networks where real decisions got made, they saw how power actually operated, not just how it was supposed to operate according to constitutional theory. They understood personalities, motivations, the hidden dynamics that shaped official politics. That knowledge was valuable, and the smart men recognized it and learned from it. But this education only happened informally in salons and private conversations. Women couldn't teach at universities, couldn't publish political treatises under their own names without being mocked or condemned, couldn't claim credit for their insights in any official way. So their intellectual contributions happened in shadows, acknowledged privately but erased publicly. Now I want to talk about something that's harder to document but equally important, the emotional and psychological insights these women developed. They were students of human nature, observers of behavior, analysts of motivation and desire. They had to be. Their survival depended on understanding people, predicting how they'd react, knowing how to influence them. This made them, in many ways, the psychologists of their era. They understood things about human behavior that wouldn't be formally theorized for another century. The power of social approval and disapproval, the ways trauma shapes personality, the connection between emotional repression and physical illness, the mechanisms of addiction and compulsion. They lived these things, observed them in others, and developed practical understanding that was sophisticated and accurate. Even if it was never written down as theory, Lady Melbourne, in particular, had insights into human psychology that were genuinely impressive. Her letters to Byron show someone who understood him better than he understood himself. She could predict how he'd react to situations, what would trigger him, what would motivate him. She used this knowledge manipulatively, yes, but it was still real knowledge, real insight into how minds and personalities work. If Lady Melbourne had been born male or born a century later, she could have been a brilliant psychologist or strategist or political advisor. Her mind was that sharp, that analytical. But she was born female in 1751, so all that intelligence got channeled into social manipulation and family advancement. It's such a waste. Not that what she did wasn't valuable, it was. But imagine what she could have contributed if she'd had access to education, to professional roles, to recognition for her abilities. The same is true for all these women. Georgiana could have been a scientist, a writer, a political theorist. Caroline could have been a novelist of the first rank if she'd had the emotional support and social acceptance to develop her talent. Even the patronesses of Elmax, their ability to run that social system so effectively shows administrative and organizational skills that could have been applied to running businesses or institutions if those opportunities had existed for women. But they didn't exist. So all that talent, all that intelligence, all that capability got poured into the narrow channels available. Social influence, informal, education, private scholarship, anonymous or pseudonymous creative work. They made the best of limited options, and they achieved remarkable things within those limits. But the limits themselves were tragic. What would Mayfair have looked like if these women had been free, if they'd had access to education, professional opportunities, legal rights, reproductive autonomy, if they'd been able to pursue their interests openly, claim credit for their work, build careers based on their abilities? I'll never know. But I'd bet anything it would have been extraordinary. Because here's what all this intellectual activity tells us. These women weren't just playing power games for the sake of power. They were hungry for meaning, for purpose, for intellectual engagement, the gambling and the affairs and the social maneuvering. Some of that was survival, but some of it was also trying to fill the void left by having no real outlet for their abilities. Georgiana threw herself into politics because she cared about ideas, about how society should be organized, about justice and reform. Her gambling was partly addiction and partly desperation. But her mineral collection, her chemistry experiments, her writing that was her feeding her mind, pursuing knowledge for its own sake, trying to be more than just a beautiful hostess and political wife. And that dimension of her life, the intellectual dimension, gives us a more complete picture of who she was, not just a victim of circumstances, not just a political player, but a whole person with curiosity and creativity and a hunger to understand the world. A person who could have contributed so much more if the world had let her. The tragedy isn't just what these women suffered, it's also what the world lost because their talents were constrained and their contributions were erased. How many scientific discoveries didn't happen because women like Georgiana couldn't pursue research professionally? How many great novels weren't written because women like Carolyn couldn't focus on their art without social persecution? How many political insights went unheard because women like Lady Melbourne had to share them privately rather than publicly? We'll never know what was lost, but we can recognize that it was substantial, that the system limiting these women didn't just hurt them personally, it impoverished society, intellectually and culturally. Everyone lost when half the population was prevented from contributing fully. And yet, despite everything, they still left marks. Georgiana's mineral collection still exists, still contributes to our understanding of Georgian scientific culture. Her novel still survives, giving us insight into how intelligent women viewed their society. Caroline's novels are being rediscovered by scholars as valuable literary works. The letters and diaries these women left behind provide crucial historical evidence about their era. They found ways to matter, to leave traces, to be remembered even though the system tried to erase them. That resilience, that determination to create and learn and contribute despite every obstacle. That's what moves me most about these women. They could have given up, accepted that their lives would be entirely about social performance and family duty. Instead, they insisted on feeding their minds, on pursuing knowledge, on creating art and beauty and understanding. They fought for intellectual lives in the margins of lives dedicated to other things, and they succeeded, at least partially. But the cost of that success, the energy it required, the battles they had to fight just to study or write or think, that cost was enormous, and it was added to all the other costs we've discussed. The emotional labor of maintaining facades, the physical toll of addiction and stress, the trauma of impossible personal situations. These women were carrying so much, trying to be so much with so little support or recognition. How did they do it? How did they keep going, keep creating, keep contributing when everything was stacked against them? I think the answer is because they had no choice. Because the alternative to struggling was giving up entirely, and they couldn't do that. So they fought for every small victory, every moment of genuine intellectual engagement, every chance to be more than what society said they should be. And in the end, their example matters. Not because they had perfect lives or made perfect choices, but because they showed that even in the most constrained circumstances, even when the system is designed to crush, human creativity and intellect and determination can find ways to express themselves. They show that women are just as capable, just as intelligent, just as hungry for knowledge as men. That limiting female potential doesn't just hurt women, it diminishes everyone. Their intellectual legacies are harder to trace than their political ones, more fragmented and forgotten. But they're real, and they deserve to be remembered alongside the more dramatic stories of scandal and suffering. Because these women were complete human beings, not just victims or villains or political players, but thinkers and creators and scholars who did remarkable work despite extraordinary barriers. Now, as we approach the end of their stories, we need to ask the hardest question. Was it worth it? All the suffering, all the struggle, all the compromises and costs, did it accomplish anything lasting? Did their influence actually change Britain, or were they just moving pieces around on a board that stayed fundamentally the same? The answers are complicated, and they're what we'll explore as we head into the final parts of this journey. On June 20th, 1837, an 18-year-old girl woke up at Kensington Palace to discover she was Queen of England. Victoria had been sleeping when her uncle King William IV died, and protocol required that she be informed immediately. So at 6 in the morning, messengers arrived, woke her up, and told her she now ruled the largest empire in the world. And Victoria, still in her night gown, asked to see her Prime Minister, the man who arrived at her door within the hour, who would guide her through her first years as monarch and remain one of her closest confidants for the rest of his life, was William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne. Lady Melbourne's son, the boy she'd schemed and maneuvered and sacrificed for. He'd made it. He was Prime Minister to a queen who adored him and trusted him completely. That's legacy. That's the result of Lady Melbourne's decades of strategic networking, of hosting the right people, of educating her son in the realities of political power. One generation removed, her influence shaped the Victorian era itself. And she's not alone. The children, grandchildren of the women we've been following, went on to become some of the most important figures in 19th century Britain. The influence these women wielded in shadows bore fruit in daylight, decades after most of them were dead. So, let's talk about legacy, about what these silent queens actually accomplished, about whether their struggles and sacrifices and strategic brilliance actually changed anything, or whether they were just rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship of aristocratic power that was already doomed. First, let's look at the most obvious form of legacy: their children. We've talked about William Lamb, but he's just the beginning. Lady Melbourne's daughter Emily, the one who was a patroness of Almack's, remember, married Lord Cowper, but had a long affair with Lord Palmerston. When Cowper died, she married Palmerston, and he became Prime Minister too. So Lady Melbourne's children gave Britain 2 Prime Ministers. That's extraordinary influence across generations. Georgiana's children also rose to prominence. Her son, William Spencer, Candish, became the 6th Duke of Devonshire. He was a significant figure in Whig politics, though not as flashy as his mother. More importantly, he maintained the tradition she had established. Devonshire House continued to be a centre of political and cultural life well into the 19th century. The slan tradition Georgiana had perfected didn't die with her. It evolved and continued, and Georgiana's daughter Harriet Little, Harry O as they called her, grew up to become a significant figure in her own right. She married Granville and became a political hostess herself, carrying on her mother's work. The influence passed down through female lines as well as male ones, which is important to recognize. But beyond individual children, we need to look at what these women accomplished politically. Did they actually change anything? Did their behind-the-scenes maneuvering make a difference? The answer is yes, though it's complicated. The Whig Party that Georgiana and Lady Melbourne supported so passionately did eventually implement major reforms. The Reform Act of 1832 expanded voting rights significantly. Not to women, unfortunately, and not to working-class men yet, but it broke the stranglehold that aristocratic families had on parliamentary seats. It was the beginning of democratization in Britain. Could that have happened without the work these women did? Maybe. Historical forces were pushing in that direction anyway, but the specific timing, the specific coalition that passed the Reform Act, the specific politicians who championed it, those were shaped by the networks these women built and maintained for decades. Charles James Fox, whom Georgiana campaigned for so dramatically in 1784, was a champion of reform. The ideas he promoted, the political culture he helped create, those influenced the next generation of reformers. So yes, their political work mattered. It didn't create the reform movement from nothing, but it shaped how it developed, who led it, how successfully it navigated the treacherous waters of aristocratic politics. There's another form of political legacy we need to talk about: the template they created for female political involvement. Georgiana's street campaigning in 1784 shocked people, but it also proved that women could participate in electoral politics. It was decades before other women followed her example openly, but the precedent existed. She'd shown it was possible, and the salon culture they perfected that became a model for how women could wield political influence in the 19th century. All through the 1800s, aristocratic women continued hosting political salons, facilitating connections, shaping discussions. The tradition Georgiana and Lady Melbourne established lasted for generations. It only really ended with World War I, when the old social order collapsed entirely. Now, I want to be clear about something. These women didn't advance women's rights in any direct way. They weren't feminists in the modern sense. Most of them would have been horrified by the suffragettes who fought for women's voting rights in the early 1900s. They worked within the existing system, not to change it fundamentally, but to maximize their influence within its constraints. But here's the interesting thing. By demonstrating that women could understand politics, could strategize effectively, could influence major decisions, they undermined the argument that women were intellectually inferior to men. They didn't make that argument themselves, but their existence, their success, served as evidence against the ideology that kept women subordinate. When people said women couldn't understand political complexity, you could point to Georgiana advising Charles James Fox or Lady Melbourne counseling multiple prime ministers and say clearly, some women can. When people said women were too emotional for political calculation, you could point to Lady Melbourne's ruthless, strategic brilliance and say, not all of them. The existence of these powerful, politically savvy women created cracks in the ideology of female inferiority. Small cracks. Not enough to bring the system down, but cracks nonetheless. Let's talk about cultural legacy too, because that's equally important. The salons these women hosted weren't just political spaces. They were where art and literature and theater and science all mixed together, where poets met politicians, where painters met philosophers, where ideas from different domains could collide and create something new. This kind of intellectual cross-pollination was crucial to the British Enlightenment and the Romantic movement that followed it, and it happened in spaces created and managed by women, not exclusively. There were male-run salons too, and coffee houses and clubs, but the female-hosted salons had a different quality. They were more inclusive of different types of people, more willing to mix high and low culture, more focused on conversation and connection rather than formal presentation. Think about Lord Byron. He became who he was partly through his interactions with women like Lady Melbourne and Lady Caroline Lamb. Yes, Caroline nearly destroyed him with her intensity, but she also inspired some of his greatest poetry. Lady Melbourne taught him about social dynamics, about how power really worked. These weren't passive muses. They were active participants in creating the cultural moment we now call Romanticism. Or think about the novel as an art form. It was developing rapidly in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and female authors were central to that development. Georgiana's The Sylph, Caroline Lamb's Glenavon, and novels by dozens of other aristocratic women. They helped establish what novels could do, how they could blend social observation with emotional drama, how they could critique society while entertaining readers. These novels haven't survived in the canon the way Jane Austen's have, but they were part of the same moment, contributing to the same evolution of the form, and they were discussed in the salons, debated and analyzed and used as springboards for broader conversations about society and morality and human nature. So the cultural legacy is real, even if it's hard to trace directly. These women created spaces where culture happened, where movements developed, where the next generation of artists and thinkers learned their craft. But I think the most profound legacy is something harder to quantify. These women proved it was possible to survive impossible circumstances with dignity and purpose. They showed that you could be trapped in a sigh, stem designed to crush you, and still find ways to matter, to contribute, to leave your mark. That's an important example. Not because we want to perpetuate systems that trap people, but because people always will be trapped in various ways by various circumstances. And these women's stories show that even in the worst situations, agency is possible, choice is possible, meaning is possible, Georgiana could have just accepted her unhappy marriage and become a quiet, bitter woman. Instead, she threw herself into politics and science and art, determined to make her life mean something beyond just producing an heir. Caroline could have submitted to the rules that were crushing her. Instead, she rebelled authentically and destructively, proving that resistance was possible, even when it came at enormous cost. Lady Melbourne could have been content with social status. Instead, she built real political power and influenced the course of British history. Were their choices perfect? No. Did they pay terrible prices? Absolutely. But they made choices. They exercised agency. They refused to be merely passive victims of their circumstances, and that matters. It matters because it tells us something true about human nature, that we can't be completely crushed, that even in the most oppressive systems, people find ways to resist, to create, to assert their humanity. These women's stories are evidence of human resilience and creativity under pressure, and that's a legacy that transcends their specific historical moment. It's relevant wherever people are trapped, wherever systems limit human potential, wherever individuals have to navigate impossible choices. The strategies they used, building networks, wielding influence indirectly, supporting each other, pursuing meaning despite constraints, those are strategies people still use today in different contexts. Now, we also have to acknowledge the limits of their legacy. They didn't dismantle the system that oppressed them. They didn't fight for women's rights broadly. They preserved aristocratic power even while operating within its constraints. Their success came at the expense of people below them in the social hierarchy, the servants who made their lifestyles possible, the poor who were excluded from the world they dominated. So their legacy is morally complicated. They're not simple heroes. They're people who did remarkable things within a deeply unjust system, while also perpetuating that system. We can admire their intelligence and resilience while also recognizing that they were complicit in structures of oppression that harmed millions of people. But here's what I find fascinating. Their own lives demonstrated why the system needed to change. The suffering they endured, the waste of their talents, the emotional and physical toll of living under such constraints, all of that was evidence that aristocratic society was broken. They were both beneficiaries of the system and casualties of it, and their casualty status, visible to anyone paying attention, helped delegitimize the system over time. When Georgiana died at 48, worn out by addiction and stress and impossible balances, people noticed. When Caroline Lamb died alone and broken, people noticed. When the stories of secret pregnancies and gambling debts and laudanum addiction filtered through society, people noticed. And slowly, gradually, the glamour of aristocratic life started to tarnish. People began questioning whether this way of organizing society actually made sense. It took a long time. The full democratization of Britain didn't happen until the 20th century. Women didn't get equal voting rights until 1928. But the process that led there started earlier, and the visible suffering of even privileged women like our Mayfair Queen's country contributed to that process. So, their legacy includes not just what they built, but also what their struggles revealed about what needed to change. They showed that even women with every material advantage were trapped and suffering. Which raised the question, if even duchesses aren't free, what does that say about the system itself? Let me tell you one more piece of the legacy story, and it's connected to someone we haven't talked about much. Princess Diana. Yes, that Diana. Because Diana Spencer, Princess of Wales, was a direct descendant of Georgiana. 4 generations removed, but the connection was real and acknowledged. Diana grew up with Georgiana's story, knew about her famous ancestor, even saw parallels between their lives. And there were parallels, weren't there? Both were young women married into the highest levels of British society. Both found their marriages loveless and struggled with that publicly. Both used their fame and charisma for causes they believed in. Both suffered from eating disorders and depression. Both died young, worn down by the pressure of impossible expectations. Diana was aware of these parallels. She saw herself as continuing a legacy of Spencer women who didn't fit easily into the roles assigned to them. And when Diana challenged royal conventions, when she used her celebrity for humanitarian causes, when she refused to suffer silently, she was doing what Georgiana had done, just in a different era with different tools. Is this too neat a narrative? Maybe. But it speaks to something real about how influence passes through generations. Georgiana couldn't have imagined someone like Diana, couldn't have predicted how the world would change. But the example she set of using whatever power you have, of refusing to be merely decorative, of insisting that your life should mean something, that example echoed forward, and it continues echoing. Georgiana's mineral collection is still at Chatsworth, still studied by geologists. Her novel is still read by scholars of 18th century literature. Her political legacy lives in the institutions and reforms her party eventually achieved. Her personal story continues inspiring people who face impossible choices and wonder if resistance is possible. That's what legacy means. Not just direct cause and effect, though that exists too, but also inspiration, example, proof that certain things are possible. These women proved that female political intelligence was real, that strategic thinking wasn't male exclusive, that even trapped people could shape history. Those proofs mattered then and still matter now. But we can't fully assess their legacy without looking at what came after. What happened to Mayfair itself, to the aristocratic system they navigated so skillfully? Did the world they dominated survive, or did it crumble, making their struggles feel futile in retrospect? Because the early 20th century brought changes none of them could have anticipated. World wars, social revolutions, the final collapse of aristocratic power, and understanding how their world ended helps us understand what their achievements meant and whether those achievements lasted beyond their own time. Stand on Piccadilly today and look where Devonshire House once stood. You won't see the magnificent mansion where Georgiana hosted her legendary salons, where the future of British politics was decided over cards and wine. You'll see a bland office building and a hotel. The house was demolished in 1924, torn down, erased. The Candish family couldn't afford to maintain it anymore, couldn't justify the massive expense of keeping up a London palace when their income from estates was collapsing. So they sold it to developers who destroyed it immediately and built something profitable in its place. That's what happened to Mayfair. That's what happened to the entire world these women dominated. It didn't fade gradually. It collapsed. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. These catastrophes destroyed aristocratic power so completely that by 1950 the world Georgiana and Lady Melbourne had navigated so skillfully might as well have been ancient history. Their palaces became office buildings. Their power became nostalgia. Their way of life became unimaginable. And the speed of that collapse tells us something important about what they had actually built. How solid was it? How much did it matter when historical forces larger than any individual swept it all away? Let's trace the decline because it's a fascinating and brutal story. The first major blow came with World War I, which started in 1914, and it's hard to overstate just how catastrophic that war was for the British aristocracy. The casualty rates among young officers and aristocratic sons almost always became officers were horrifying. Something like 20% of British peers under the age of 50 died in that war. 20%. Entire family lines ended. Heirs who were supposed to inherit estates and titles died in the mud of Flanders, and their younger brothers died too. And suddenly families that had been secure for centuries had no male heirs at all. The financial cost was equally devastating. Aristocratic families had been living beyond their means for decades, maintaining lifestyles that increasingly didn't match their actual income. Their wealth came primarily from land, from tenant farmers paying rent. But Agricultural income had been declining since the 1880s due to cheap grain imports from America and the Empire. Many estates were already running deficits before the war. Then came the war taxes. The British government needed money desperately, so they raised taxes on the wealthy to unprecedented levels. Estate tax, EES, income taxes, capital gains taxes, all went up dramatically. Families that had never really worried about money suddenly found themselves unable to pay their bills. They started selling off land, artworks, family heirlooms, anything to generate cash, and there was nowhere to hide the money. The old tricks, land held in trust, wealth spread across generations, those still worked to some degree, but the scale of taxation was so massive that even careful planning couldn't protect you completely. For the first time in centuries, being an aristocrat didn't guarantee financial security. The social changes were just as dramatic. Before the war, there was still this sense that aristocrats were a breed apart, naturally suited to lead, deserving of their privileges. The war destroyed that myth completely when aristocratic officers sent working-class soldiers to die in pointless charges, when their strategic incompetence caused catastrophic casualties, when it became clear that inherited titles didn't correlate with actual ability. The respect that had sustained aristocratic power evaporated. After the war, Britain was different, more democratic, more skeptical of inherited privilege, more willing to challenge the old order. Women got the vote in 1918, though only women over 30 who owned property. Full equal suffrage came in 1928. The political landscape that Georgiana and Lady Melbourne had navigated, where power resided in aristocratic networks, and women could only influence things indirectly, that landscape ceased to exist. The salon culture died too. Why host political gatherings in private homes when political parties now had official organizations, professional staff, democratic processes for selecting candidates? The informal networking that used to happen at Devonshire House now happened in party offices and public forums. The role these women had played facilitating G-connections, creating spaces for political discussion, became obsolete, and LMAX, that symbol of exclusive social power. It had already been declining since the 1830s, but it lingered into the 1870s, before finally being sold and renamed. By 1941, the building was destroyed in the Blitz, German bombs finishing what social change had started. The voucher system that once determined social life and death became a quaint historical curiosity, something people read about and couldn't quite believe had ever mattered so much. The mansions themselves became unsustainable. Devonshire House went in 1924, as I mentioned, but it wasn't alone. In the 1920s and 30s, approximately 25 massive aristocratic houses in Mayfair were demolished. The economics just didn't work anymore. These houses required enormous staffs, dozens of servants just to maintain daily operations. They had massive heating bills, maintenance costs, property taxes, and the families who owned them had seen their incomes plummet. So they sold. Developers bought the land, demolished the historic buildings and put up office blocks and apartment buildings and hotels, things that generated income in the modern economy, things that didn't require armies of servants, things that made financial sense in a world where aristocratic prestige no longer translated into actual wealth. Can you imagine being the 9th Duke of Devonshire, watching the house your family had owned for 200 years being torn down, knowing that the room where your great-great-grandmother Georgiana had hosted salons that shaped British politics was about to become rubble? That must have felt like the end of the world. And in a sense, it was the end of their world, at least. But here's what's interesting. Some families adapted. They turned their country estates into tourist attractions, opened them to the public, found ways to generate income from Ayr, Heritage, Chadsworth. The Devonshire family's country house did this successfully. You can visit it today and see Georgiana's mineral collection, walk through rooms she walked through, get a glimpse of how that world functioned. Other families weren't so lucky or so clever. They lost everything, Estates were sold to pay debts, broken up and auctioned off piece by piece. Family collections built over centuries were dispersed. Some aristocratic families, that had been prominent for 500 years, essentially ceased to exist as meaningful entities by the mid-10th century. The ones who survived did so by fundamentally changing what it meant to be aristocratic. They got jobs, actual jobs, working for a living. They married for love rather than strategic advantage. They abandoned the idea that they were a separate breed of human deserving special privileges. They became essentially upper middle class people with fancy titles and interesting family histories, which is fine, actually, but it's completely different from what their ancestors were. Now you might be thinking good. The aristocracy was unjust. Their power was undemocratic. The system oppressed millions of people. Its collapse was necessary and beneficial. And you'd be right. The democratization of Britain, the expansion of rights and opportunities to people who'd been excluded, these were unambiguously good things. The world that replaced aristocratic dominance is better, fairer, more just. But here's the complicated part. When that world collapsed, so did the power these women had built. The influence Georgiana wielded through her salon, meaningless. Once salons became obsolete, the networks Lady Melbourne constructed, irrelevant once politics became institutionalized and democratic. The social gatekeeping of the Almy's patronesses, absurd once society stopped being so rigidly hierarchical, so their power was contingent. It depended entirely on a specific social structure. And when that structure collapsed, their power went with it. Which makes you wonder, did they accomplish anything lasting? Or were they just rearranging furniture on the Titanic, exercising power that was always going to disappear regardless of how skillfully they wielded it? I think the answer is both. Their specific power was contingent and temporary. But what? They demonstrated that women could understand politics, could strategize effectively, could influence major historical events. That was lasting. It became evidence used by later generations of women fighting for rights and opportunities. The suffragettes who fought for women's voting rights in the early 1900s, they knew about Georgiana's campaigning in 1784. They used it as proof that women had always been politically engaged, just denied official channels for that engagement. The argument for women's suffrage wasn't women should be allowed to participate in politics for the first time. It was women have always participated in politics, and now we're demanding the right to do so openly and officially. So Georgiana's legacy lived on even after her world disappeared. Same with Lady Melbourne. Her strategic brilliance, her political acumen, these became part of the evidence base for arguing that women were just as capable as men. Not because anyone admired her, specifically. Her reputation was too cold, too manipulative for that. But because she existed, because she demonstrably influenced major political events, she was proof that the ideology of female inferiority was wrong. The cultural legacy lasted longer than the political one. The novels Caroline Lamb and Georgiana and dozens of other aristocratic women wrote, they survived. Not all of them, but enough to show that women had been literary forces even when they weren't officially recognized as such. The L.A. tours and diaries they left behind became crucial historical sources, documenting their era in detail. That wouldn't exist otherwise. And the example they set of pursuing intellectual interest despite obstacles, of creating spaces for culture and ideas to flourish, of insisting that their lives should have meaning beyond just social obligations. That example inspired later generations of women, not directly necessarily, but as part of a broader tradition of women refusing to be limited by what society said they could or couldn't do. There's one more aspect of the decline we need to discuss, and it's the most personal. What happened to their actual descendants? We talked about William Lamb becoming Prime Minister to Victoria, but what about later generations? The aristocratic families these women belonged to mostly still exist. The Dukes of Devonshire still hold that title. The Spencer family still exists. Princess Diana was one of them, as we mentioned. But these families now are nothing like what they were. They're wealthy by normal standards, but not astonishingly so. They have interesting histories, but not actual power. They're curiosities, basically. Living remnants of a vanished world. And I wonder how they feel about it. The current Duke of Devonshire, for example. Does he think about Georgiana? Does he feel connected to her story, or is it just abstract family history? Does he wish the old system still existed, or is he glad it's gone? I don't know. But there must be something strange about being the heir to a tradition of power and privilege that doesn't actually exist anymore, except as tourist attraction and historical footnote. The physical traces are disappearing too. Devonshire House is gone. As I said, most of the great Mayfair mansions are gone. The streets are still there, still expensive, still prestigious in a way, but they're full of embassies and corporate headquarters and luxury apartments owned by international billionaires. The Georgian buildings that remain are offices or hotels or divided into flats. The world our silent queens inhabited has been literally built over, replaced by something unrecognizable. You can still walk the same streets Georgiana walked, stand on Piccadilly, look at Grosvenor Square. Imagine what it was like when this was the center of British power, but it requires effort, imagination. There's nothing obvious telling you that world-changing decisions were once made in these buildings, that the most powerful women in Britain once lived here, that this neighborhood was once synonymous with influence and glamour and political intrigue. Is that sad, or is it just the natural progression of history? Everything passes. Every era thinks it will last forever, and every era is wrong. The aristocracy Georgiana belonged to probably seemed permanent, unchangeable, as natural as the sun rising. And then, within 3 generations of her death, it was gone. But here's what doesn't disappear. Human nature, the desires that drove these women for meaning, for influence, for intellectual engagement, for love, for escape from pain, those are universal and timeless. The specific ways they pursued those desires were shaped by their era, but the desires themselves, we still have those. We still struggle with many of the same tensions they did. How do you find meaning when your circumstances are constraining? How do you build influence when official power is denied to you? How do you survive when the system seems designed to crush you? How do you balance public performance with private truth? These aren't historical questions. These human questions that every generation has to answer for themselves. And the answers Georgiana and Lady Melbourne and Caroline and all the others found: strategic networking, intel, actual pursuit, rebellion, adaptation, creative, resistance. Those are still valid answers. The specific tactics change. The underlying strategies remain relevant. That's why their stories matter, even though their world is gone. Not because we should try to recreate aristocratic society. God, no. But because they faced universal human challenges in extreme form, and watching how they navigated those challenges teaches us something about possibility, about resilience, about the human capacity to find agency even in terrible circumstances. Their palaces are gone. Their salons are extinct. Their specific form of power has vanished completely. But their example remains. And in the final part of our journey, we're going to pull back and look at what that example means for us now. What can 21st century people learn from 18th century aristocratic women? What's the takeaway from this long, complicated story of power and suffering and brilliance and constraint? What do the silent queens of Mayfair have to teach us about navigating our own complicated world? Because I think the answer might surprise you. Here's a question I want you to think about. When was the last time you hid what you were really feeling to get through a difficult situation? When did you last smile through something painful because showing weakness felt too dangerous? When did you last play a role, employee, parent, friend, even though you wanted to scream? or cry or just disappear. If you're honest, it was probably recent. Maybe today, maybe right now. Welcome to the most important lesson these silent queens have to teach us. We're all performing, we're all navigating systems that constrain us, we're all finding ways to exercise agency within circumstances we didn't choose and often can't change. The specifics are different, the stakes are usually lower, but the fundamental human experience of being trapped and free at the same time, of having to play strategic games while also trying to live authentically, that's timeless. So, let's talk about what Georgiana and Lady Melbourne and Caroline and all the others can teach us across the centuries, what their struggles and strategies and successes and failures mean for people living in a completely different world. Because I think they have more to teach us than you might expect. First lesson. Invisible labor is still labor, and it still matters. The work these women did, facilitating connections, maintaining relationships, creating spaces where important things could happen, managing complex social dynamics. All of that was essential to how their society functioned, but it was invisible. It wasn't counted as real work. It wasn't compensated or officially recognized. It just happened as if by magic because women were doing it. Sound familiar? Think about emotional labor in workplaces. Who remembers everyone's birthdays? Who notices when someone's struggling and checks in on them? Who smooths over conflict and makes sure the team functions well together? Usually, women, and usually without recognition or compensation. It's just expected. The same way Georgiana's work building political networks was expected, essential but invisible, valued but not respected. Understanding this pattern helps us see it operating in our own lives. Once you notice that certain kinds of labor are rendered invisible, you can start making them visible, naming them, demanding that they be recognized and valued. That's not a small thing. That's how change begins. Second lesson, strategic silence versus authentic expression is a choice everyone faces, and there's no universal right answer. Lady Melbourne chose strategic silence and ruthless calculation. She survived, achieved her goals, shaped history, but she paid for it with isolation and emotional disconnecti. Caroline Lamb chose authentic expression and loud rebellion. She was destroyed for it, but she lived and died as herself, never pretending to be what she wasn't. Neither approach is objectively better. Both have costs and benefits, and we all have to make versions of this choice constantly. When do you speak up at work, and when do you stay quiet? When do you express your real feelings in a relationship, and when do you manage them strategically? When do you challenge injustice, and when do you pick your battles? There's no formula. But knowing that this tension exists, understanding that brilliant women have struggled with it throughout history, that helps. It reminds us that whatever we choose, we're not alone in facing the choice, and that both silence and voice have their place and their cost. Third lesson, systems that trap people force them to be creative, and that creativity has value even when it happens within unjust constraints. These women couldn't vote, couldn't own property, couldn't pursue careers. So they invented new forms of influence. They turned hosting parties into political power. They turned personal relationships into strategic assets. They found every crack in the system and exploited it brilliantly. That's creativity under constraint. And it's something we can all learn from. Whatever limitations you're facing, financial, social, physical, circumstantial, there are always cracks, always spaces where agency is possible, always ways to push back against what feels immovable. These women proved that. They showed that even in the most rigid systems, human ingenuity finds paths forward. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. This doesn't mean oppressive. Systems are okay, because people can be creative within them. It doesn't mean we should accept injustice, because victims can sometimes navigate it successfully. The system these women lived under was terrible, and its destruction was necessary. But individual creativity and resilience within bad systems is still real and still valuable. Both things can be true simultaneously. Fourth lesson, addiction and self-destruction are often symptoms of unbearable circumstances, not moral failures. Georgiana's gambling, her lord use, her drinking, these weren't character flaws. They were responses to a life that was crushing her. When you can't escape circumstances that are slowly destroying you find ways to numb the pain or create temporary escapes. That's a human response to inhuman situations. We're better at recognizing this now than people were in Georgiana's time. We understand addiction as disease, as something requiring treatment and compassion rather than judgment, but we still sometimes forget that the circumstances matter as much as the addiction itself, that fixing the individual without addressing the circumstances usually doesn't work. So when you see someone struggling, maybe yourself, maybe someone you love with destructive coping mechanisms, ask what are they trying to escape from? What circumstances are making their life unbearable? The compassion these women deserved but rarely received, we can extend to ourselves and each other. Now, fifth lesson, intellectual hunger doesn't disappear just because opportunities are limited. Georgiana pursued science despite having no formal education and no access to universities. Caroline wrote novels despite social persecution. Countless aristocratic women created salons, corresponded with intellectuals, studied privately, contributed to culture and knowledge despite every obstacle. That hunger to understand, to create, to engage intellectually, it's fundamental to being human, and it finds expression regardless of circumstances. Today, we have opportunities these women couldn't have imagined. Education is accessible to women. Creative expression is possible through countless platforms. Intellectual communities exist online and offline, but we still face obstacles, economic barriers, time, constraints, social pressures, self-doubt, and the example of these women who pursued knowledge despite far greater obstacles. That's encouraging. If Georgiana could build a significant mineral collection and study chemistry while managing everything else in her impossible life, surely we can find time for the intellectual pursuits that feed our souls. Sixth lesson, the powerful can be simultaneously oppressors and oppressed. These women were trapped and suffering in real ways, but they were also participants in a system that oppressed millions of people below them socially. Their servants, the poor, the working class. Those people suffered far more than any duchess ever did, and they suffered partly because the aristocracy hoarded resources and power. This complexity is important. It reminds us that oppression isn't simple, that you can be a victim of one system while benefiting from another, that your suffering is real but doesn't erase your complicity in others' suffering, and that fighting for your own freedom while ignoring others' oppression is incomplete. Justice. In our world, this plays out in concepts like intersectionality, understanding that someone can face gender discrimination while benefiting from racial or class privilege. That liberation movements need to consider multiple forms of oppression simultaneously. The women of Mayfair didn't understand this. They fought for their own space within aristocratic power, not for dismantling hierarchy itself, but their story helps us see why that's inadequate, why real justice requires looking beyond our immediate concerns. Seventh lesson, legacy is complicated and often unexpected. These women thought they were building something permanent. Eve thought their power would pass to their children and grandchildren in recognizable forms. They had no idea their entire world would collapse within a few generations, but they left traces anyway. Not the ones they intended, maybe, but traces nonetheless. Evidence of female capability, examples of resilience, warnings about the cost of oppressive systems, inspiration for later generations fighting different battles. We can't control our legacy, can't determine how we'll be remembered or what parts of our work will matter to future generations. But we can live with integrity and purpose and hope that something valuable survives us. These women did that, and we can too. Eighth lesson, and maybe the most important. Your life can matter even when the system says it shouldn't, even when you're denied official recognition, even when you're operating in the margins, even when you're forced to work through indirect means. These women were told their minds were inferior, their opinions irrelevant, their proper sphere limited to domestic concerns, and they ignored that. They built power anyway, they shaped history anyway, they mattered anyway. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been told your contributions don't count, if you've ever had to fight for recognition of work you know is valuable, you're in good company. Brilliant women have been fighting that fight for centuries and they've won, slowly and incompletely. But they've won. We have rights and opportunities they couldn't imagine because they insisted on being taken seriously even when society refused. That fight continues in different forms, in different contexts, but it continues, and knowing that women have been fighting it successfully for generations, that's strength, that's permission to keep pushing, keep insisting, keep refusing to accept that certain voices don't matter. Now I want to step back and look at the full arc of this story. We started in muddy fields that became Mayfair. We watched young girls get traded in marriage to men they didn't know. We saw them build power through salons and strategic relationships. We watched them suffer from addiction, from trapped circumstances, from impossible choices. We saw them create novels, scientific collections, political strategies, cultural spaces. We witnessed their world collapse and their legacies echo forward into ours. It's been a long journey, 2.5 hours of stories spanning generations and covering triumph and tragedy in equal measure. And what are we left with? I think we're left with a more complete picture of what power means. It's not simple. It's not just about who sits on thrones or holds official positions. Real power flows through networks, operates in shadows, shapes culture and ideas and possibilities. The women of Mayfair understood that, exploited it, and proved that influence can exist even when authority is denied. We're also left with deep empathy for people trapped in circumstances not of their choosing. These women weren't saints or villains. They were humans trying to survive, trying to matter, trying to find meaning in lives that often felt meaningless. They made choices we might not make. They perpetuated systems we'd rightly condemn. But they also showed extraordinary courage and creativity and resilience. They deserve to be remembered as full, complex human beings, not simplified into heroines or cautionary tales. And we're left with questions that remain relevant. How do we find agency within constraint? How do we balance strategic silence with authentic expression? How do we pursue meaning when circumstances are limiting? How do we build power without becoming oppressive ourselves? These aren't historical questions, they're human questions. And the answers these women found, imperf. CT, costly but real. Those answers still speak to us. So what do we do with all this? With these stories of silken shadows, of power wielded quietly and lives lived desperately, I think we honor them. We remember that history is more complicated than simple narratives of progress or decline. We acknowledge that women have always been agents of history. Even when official records ignored them, we learn from their strategies and their mistakes. We extend to ourselves and each other the compassion they rarely received. And we build a world where the choices they faced between survival and authenticity, between silent power and public destruction, those choices become less stark, less impossible, less costly. The silent queens of Mayfair can't speak for themselves anymore. Their world is gone. Their palaces are demolished. Their specific form of power is extinct, but their stories survive. And those stories tell us something essential about human nature, about resilience, about the ways people find to matter despite everything conspiring against them. They tell us that we are stronger than we think, more creative than we realize, capable of surviving and even shaping impossible circumstances. They tell us that visibility isn't required for significance, that indirect power is still power, that influence echoes forward in ways we can't predict or control, and they tell us that every era thinks it's permanent, every system believes it's inevitable, every form of power assumes it will last forever, and every era is wrong. Everything changes, everything passes. The question is what we do with the time we have, what traces we leave, whether we use whatever power we have, however limited, however constrained, to push towards something better. The women of Mayfair did that in complicated, flawed, sometimes problematic ways, but they did it. They refused to be nothing. They insisted on mattering. And across the centuries, their insistence echoes still. So, thank you for walking this journey with me. Thank you for spending these hours in the shadows of history, learning about women whose names you might not have known this morning, but who shaped the world in ways that still affect us. Thank you for your patience with the complexity, for not demanding simple heroes or villains, for sitting with the contradictions and complications that make these stories true. I hope you found something valuable here. Maybe inspiration, maybe warning, maybe just the satisfaction of understanding a piece of history that doesn't usually get told. Whatever you take from this, I hope it stays with you. I hope the next time you walk through a challenging situation, you remember Georgiana strategizing in her drawing room. The next time you face impossible choices, you remember Caroline choosing authenticity over survival. The next time you doubt your own influence, you remember Lady Melbourne shaping the course of an empire from shadows. You're more powerful than you think, more capable than systems tell you, more resilient than circumstances suggest. The Silent Queens prove that. And you can too. There are so many more stories, waiting in the shadows of history. So many women whose names have been forgotten, but whose influence shaped our world. So many examples of power exercised quietly, of resistance happening in margins, of humans refusing to be crushed by systems designed to break them. I'll be here exploring those stories, bringing them into light, and I hope you'll be here too, ready for the next journey into the past that illuminates the present. Until then, sleep well. Dream of drawing rooms and political intrigue, of mineral collections and secret pregnancies, of women who refused to be silent even when silence was demanded. Dream of Mayfair in its go. Elden age when queens ruled from shadows and power wore silk. And remember, you're part of this story, too. Not as aristocracy, not as historical figures, but as humans, navigating constraint and seeking agency and trying to matter despite everything. The struggle continues. The questions remain, and the answers, well, those are yours to find. Thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next.